They say a man reveals his true nature on his wedding night. For Duke Adrian Blackthorne, that revelation came wrapped in bruises he didn't inflict and terror he couldn't yet name. While the kingdom celebrated the union of two great houses with champagne and orchestras, he stood alone in the marble corridor outside his bridal chamber, studying a single drop of blood on the doorframe that shouldn't have been there. Something was catastrophically wrong with the woman he'd just married, and every instinct honed through years of cold political warfare told him this wasn't about love or duty anymore. This was about survival. Hers, maybe his, and the empire of secrets balanced between them. Stay with me through this, because what starts as a wedding night becomes a hunt for truth that will burn everything Adrian thought he knew about power, trust, and the woman now wearing his name. The cathedral bells had stopped ringing an hour ago, but Adrian could still feel the vibrations in his bones. He stood before the floor-length mirror in his private chambers, methodically removing the ceremonial regalia that had transformed him into a symbol rather than a man. The golden sash, the family crest pinned over his heart, the ridiculous white gloves that made him look like he was attending a funeral instead of a wedding. Maybe he was. Marriage, political marriage especially, was a kind of death. Death of autonomy, death of choice, birth of obligation. Adrian had always known this day would come. The Blackthorne line didn't maintain its power through sentiment or spontaneity. Every generation understood the arithmetic. Land plus title plus strategic alliance equals survival. His father had spelled it out during Adrian's 16th birthday, drunk on brandy and nostalgia, explaining how he'd met Adrian's mother exactly twice before their wedding and learned to love her somewhere between the third miscarriage and Adrian's difficult birth. A hell of a bedtime story. The Duke's reflection stared back at him now, all sharp angles and darker angles. 32 years old, and people already called him the Iron Duke behind his back, sometimes to his face when they wanted to test his patience. He'd earned the nickname through a decade of ruthless negotiation, strategic marriages arranged for his sisters, and an almost supernatural ability to remain untouched by scandal while demolishing anyone who threatened Blackthorne interests. Cold, they said. Calculating. Emotionless. Adrian preferred the term efficient. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sharp, professional. Not the tentative tap of a servant, but the controlled urgency of someone who understood hierarchy. "Come in," he said without turning. Victor Ashford entered, Evelyn's older cousin, dressed in the formal attire that marked him as the Ashford family's representative. The man's face carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent years navigating dangerous social waters. Behind that mask, Adrian detected something else. Relief, maybe. Or was it guilt? "Your Grace," Victor began, then paused. "The wedding was magnificent. The kingdom will talk about it for years. Spare me the flattery, Victor. What do you need?" The cousin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Direct, as always. "I wanted to ensure the transfer documents were in order. The Ashford lands, the dowry arrangements, the legal merger of our houses." Adrian finally turned from the mirror, his full attention landing on Victor like a spotlight. "Everything was notarized this morning. Your family's solicitor confirmed it personally. Unless you're suggesting there's a problem I should know about?" No problem," Victor said too quickly. "I simply wanted to make certain, for Evelyn's sake." The way he said her name made Adrian pause. There was something protective in it, but also something that sounded like an apology. "Your cousin seems terrified of this arrangement," Adrian observed, watching Victor's reaction carefully. During the ceremony, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the ceremonial flowers. "I've seen prisoners walking to execution look more composed." Victor's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "Lady Evelyn has always been reserved, anxious in crowds. It's her nature." "Is it?" Adrian let the statement hang between them, not quite a question, not quite an accusation. The silence stretched until Victor broke it. "She'll adjust. The Ashford women always do. They understand duty." Something about that phrase made Adrian's instincts flare. The Ashford women always do. Not people, not individuals. Women, categorized and managed like livestock. "Tell me something, Victor. Why did your family push so hard for this marriage? The Blackthorne name has value, certainly, but the Ashfords aren't desperate. Your uncle controls half the textile trade in the eastern provinces. You don't need my money." Victor's expression shuddered completely. Strategic alliance, Your Grace. Surely you understand that better than anyone. I understand necessity, Adrian corrected. I don't understand eagerness. Your uncle negotiated this marriage like a man trying to close a deal before the other party discovers a problem with the merchandise. The cousin's face went pale, then flushed red. Lady Evelyn is not merchandise. Then why does she look at me like I'm the executioner? Adrian took a step closer, using his height advantage deliberately. What exactly am I inheriting along with your family's land holdings and textile contracts? Victor retreated toward the door, his composure fracturing. You're inheriting a wife, Your Grace. As arranged, as agreed upon by both our houses. If you have concerns about Lady Evelyn's demeanor, perhaps you should discuss them with her directly. He left before Adrian could press further, pulling the door shut with more force than strictly necessary. Adrian stood alone again, the conversation replaying in his mind. Strategic alliance, the Ashford women always do. Discuss them with her directly. Something was wrong, deeply, structurally wrong. The Duke crossed to his desk and pulled out the file he'd compiled on the Ashfords during the negotiation process. 6 months of research conducted by his most discreet investigators, every detail documented and cross-referenced. Land holdings, business contracts, family trees going back 4 generations. He'd studied it all before agreeing to the marriage, looking for weaknesses, leverage, and hidden liabilities. Now he read it differently, looking for absences instead of presences. Evelyn's mother, deceased when Evelyn was 9. Riding accident, according to official records. Closed casket funeral. Father remarried within 8 months to a woman who died 2 years later. Pneumonia. Quick decline. Another closed casket. Evelyn's father himself passed 5 years ago. Heart failure at 48, relatively young for aristocracy, with access to the best physicians. The estate passed to his brother, Evelyn's uncle, Lord Edmund Ashford, who'd served as Evelyn's guardian ever since. Guardian. Adrian turned the word over in his mind. Protector. Warden. Jailer. What kind of guardian produced a ward who flinched when touched and trembled through her own wedding? The clock struck midnight, the sound echoing through the stone corridors of Blackthorn Manor. According to tradition, the Duke should be making his way to the bridal suite by now, where his new wife would be waiting in whatever state of preparedness or terror the Ashford women had left her in. Duty called. Obligation beckoned. Adrian stood, straightened his shirt, and walked toward the door with the mechanical precision of a man approaching a business transaction. That's what this was, after all. A merger of interests. The personal element was incidental, contractual. He would treat Evelyn with the same cold courtesy he afforded his business partners. No cruelty, no unnecessary intimacy, just the minimum interaction required to maintain appearances and eventually produce an heir. Simple. Transactional. Survivable. The bridal suite occupied the East Wing's highest floor, a sprawling set of rooms that had belonged to his mother until her death. Adrian had ordered them redecorated for Evelyn's arrival, replacing his mother's dark velvet and heavy furniture with lighter fabrics and more windows. An attempt at welcome, or at least at making the cage more comfortable. Now, standing outside the carved double doors, he noticed what he'd missed earlier. A thin streak of something dark near the brass handle. He touched it with one finger and it came away red. Fresh blood, still slightly wet. Adrian's hand went to the door handle automatically, but he forced himself to pause. Knocked instead. Professional courtesy, even in the bizarre intimacy of a wedding night. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Lady Evelyn? A muffled sound from inside. Not quite a word, more like a strangled sob cut off mid-breath. The Duke didn't knock a third time. He opened the door and stepped into his new wife's private hell. The bridal suite looked like the aftermath of a violent struggle translated into stillness. Furniture overturned, curtains half torn from their rods. The remains of what should have been a romantic dinner scattered across the carpet, wine soaking into expensive fabric like blood from a wound. And in the center of it all, Evelyn. She sat on the floor beside the massive 4-poster bed, still wearing her wedding dress, though the delicate fabric was torn at the shoulder and stained with wine and what looked like mud. Her elaborate hairstyle had collapsed into a tangle of dark curls stuck to her face with tears and sweat. Both hands were wrapped around her knees, holding herself together through pure force of will. When Adrian entered, she didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him. Just sat there rocking slightly, breathing in short, controlled gasps, like someone trying not to scream. The Duke stood frozen in the doorway, his carefully prepared speeches about duty and mutual respect evaporating. This wasn't a nervous bride. This was a survivor in the immediate aftermath of trauma. "Evelyn," he said quietly, using her name instead of her title. "What happened here?" She finally looked at him, and Adrian saw eyes that held no hope of rescue or relief. Only calculation. The desperate arithmetic of someone assessing which danger was least immediately fatal. "Nothing happened, Your Grace," she said, her voice eerily steady despite the tears still sliding down her face. "I was clumsy. Knocked over the dinner service. I apologize for the mess." It was such an obvious lie that Adrian almost laughed. "Almost. You expect me to believe you did all this?" He gestured at the destruction. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it's easier than the truth, Your Grace." Adrian closed the door behind him and locked it, not to trap her, but to ensure privacy from the servants who were undoubtedly hovering nearby, collecting gossip to trade in the kitchen. He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, giving her time to track his movement and recognize he wasn't rushing at her. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped and lowered himself to the floor, sitting cross-legged like they were children at a campfire instead of aristocrats in a destroyed bridal chamber. "I'm going to tell you something, Lady Evelyn, and I need you to believe me. I didn't marry you to hurt you. I married you because both our families decided it was strategically advantageous. I'm not a good man, I'm not a kind man, but I'm not the kind of man who finds pleasure in fear. So whatever truth is easier than this lie, I'd prefer to hear it now rather than discover it later." Evelyn stared at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. Her whole body remained tense, coiled, ready to run or fight or collapse. "You can't prefer the truth," she finally said. "No one does. Try me." She laughed then, a broken sound that made Adrian's chest tighten unexpectedly. "You want the truth? Fine. Here's the truth, Your Grace. I destroyed this room myself, not from clumsiness, from rage, from terror, from the desperate, pathetic need to destroy something, anything, because I've spent 5 years being destroyed, and tonight was supposed to be the night I finally disappeared completely." Adrian kept his expression neutral, his tone even. "Disappeared how?" "Into you. Into this marriage. Into the role of Duchess Blackthorne, silent and obedient and grateful. That's what my uncle promised them, you see. That's what he sold along with the land and the contracts. A perfectly trained wife who would never question, never challenge, never tell you what the Ashford fortune was really built on." "Tell me." Evelyn shook her head violently. "You don't want to know. No one wants to know. That's the whole problem." Adrian leaned forward slightly, catching her eyes and holding them. "I asked? That means I want to know." She searched his face for something, some sign of deception or cruelty or the inevitable betrayal she'd clearly learned to expect. Whatever she found, it made her shoulders sag with exhaustion. "My uncle is a thief," she said flatly. "He stole my inheritance through forged documents when my father died. He's been systematically embezzling from the Ashford estate for years, bleeding it dry while maintaining appearances. Anyone who discovered the truth or tried to help me expose it vanished. Servants dismissed without reference. A tutor who asked too many questions about the account books found dead in what they called a robbery. My own lady's maid disappeared 3 months ago when my uncle thought she was helping me gather evidence." Adrian's mind raced through implications. "And the marriage? A way to legitimize the theft. Once I'm your wife, everything that was mine becomes legally yours. My uncle controls it all as administrator until theoretical heirs come of age. By then, there won't be anything left to inherit. He'll have moved it all to foreign accounts or dissolved it into his own holdings. And I'll be here, trapped in Blackthorne Manor, with no family, no fortune, and no way to prove any of it ever belonged to me in the first place." The Duke sat back, processing. It was elegant in a vicious sort of way. Use marriage to erase evidence, neutralize the victim, and secure control of assets all in one legal stroke. And by choosing the Iron Duke as the groom, Lord Edmund had guaranteed that even if Evelyn did speak up, who would believe her over the combined authority of 2 powerful men? "Why didn't you refuse the marriage?" Adrian asked. "You could have objected during the ceremony, created a scandal." Evelyn smiled, and it was the saddest expression Adrian had ever seen. Because my uncle made it very clear what would happen if I embarrassed the family publicly. He has a special room in the east cellar of Ashford House, soundproofed. He showed it to me the night before we left for the cathedral, told me exactly what happens to Ashford women who forget their place. And I believe him, Your Grace. I believe him because I've seen what he's capable of when no one's watching. She held out her left wrist, and Adrian saw what he'd missed during the ceremony because of the elaborate lace sleeves, bruises, dark purple and yellow, and the distinctive pattern of fingers that had gripped too hard. And beneath those, older scars. Thin white lines that spoke of cuts healed badly or deliberately left untreated. So I didn't refuse, Evelyn continued. I stood in that cathedral and said the words and smiled for the portraits and came here to this beautiful prison you've built for me. And I destroyed this room because it's the only thing I'm allowed to destroy without being destroyed in return. Adrian felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not pity, exactly. More like recognition. He'd built his reputation on being untouchable, unreachable, armored by privilege and power. But armor worked both ways. It protected, but it also isolated. He'd stood alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to witness someone else's genuine vulnerability. And now here was this woman, this stranger who'd become his wife, showing him exactly what desperation looked like when it had nowhere left to go. "Show me," he said. "What?" "The forged documents, the evidence of embezzlement, whatever proof you've managed to hide. Show me, and I'll decide if your uncle is as untouchable as he thinks." Evelyn's expression shifted from shock to suspicion. "Why would you help me? You gain nothing by exposing him. The marriage is legal. The contracts are signed. What does it matter to you if my uncle is a thief?" Adrian stood, offering his hand to help her up. She stared at it like it might transform into a weapon. "It matters," he said simply, "because I don't share power well. Your uncle thinks he's maneuvered me into being his accomplice. He's mistaken. I don't like being used, and I don't tolerate theft. If he's stolen from you, he's stolen from me. That makes this personal." It was calculated, that speech. Adrian knew exactly what buttons to push, what language would resonate with his own reputation. But underneath the calculation, something else stirred. A genuine offense at Edmund Ashford's arrogance. The man had looked Adrian Blackthorne in the eye during negotiations and lied, assuming the Iron Duke was too cold or too stupid or too wrapped up in his own interest to notice. Bad assumption. Evelyn finally took his hand, her fingers cold and trembling. He pulled her to her feet gently, maintaining a careful distance even as he steadied her. "I hid copies of the original will and some of the financial documents in my mother's jewelry box," she said. "Uncle Edmund thought he destroyed everything, but Mother taught me to keep secrets before she died. The box has a false bottom. I smuggled it here in my trousseau." "Smart woman, your mother, for all the good it did her." Evelyn's voice went flat again. "She knew what my uncle was, tried to warn my father." 2 weeks later, writing accident. Closed casket. Adrian felt that unfamiliar sensation intensify. Not quite anger, colder than that, more focused. "Get the box," he said. "We're going to start unraveling your uncle's empire tonight." "And Evelyn, one more thing." She paused halfway to the dresser, looking back at him warily. "Yes? Whatever your uncle threatened you with, whatever he promised would happen if you defied him, he'll have to go through me first now. That's not chivalry, that's practicality. You're a Blackthorne now, which makes you my asset, and I protect my assets with the same ruthlessness I apply to everything else." It wasn't a declaration of love or even affection. It was a business proposition delivered with brutal honesty. But something in Evelyn's expression cracked open, just slightly. A tiny fissure in the armor of despair she'd been wearing like a second skin. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, quieter, "I didn't expect that." "Expect what?" "Honesty. Everyone else pretends. Performs concern while doing nothing. You're at least honest about the calculation." Adrian nodded. "Honesty is more efficient than pretense. Now get the box. We have work to do." Evelyn retrieved the jewelry box from where it had been hidden beneath layers of silk undergarments in her trousseau trunk. It was an ornate thing, mahogany inlaid with mother of pearl, sized for a small girl's treasures. She brought it to the writing desk near the window and triggered the hidden latch that released the false bottom. Inside were folded documents, yellowed slightly with age but still legible. Adrian spread them across the desk with the precision of a general planning a campaign. His father's original will, unaltered. A ledger showing the true state of Ashford finances before Edmund's interference. Correspondence between Edmund and various business partners discussing the liquidation of assets that should have been protected as part of Evelyn's inheritance. It was damning, comprehensive, and completely useless in a court of law unless they could prove authenticity and chain of custody. Your uncle will claim these are forgeries, Adrian said, studying the documents. He'll say you created them out of spite or delusion. We need supporting evidence. Witnesses, transaction records, something that corroborates the story these documents tell. There's more, Evelyn said quietly. My maid, before she disappeared, she managed to make contact with a clerk in Uncle Edmund's London office, someone who'd been keeping duplicate records because he suspected what was happening. She was supposed to meet him the night she vanished. The clerk is still alive? As far as I know. Mary gave me his name before she left. Thomas Whitmore. He works in the records department, but I had no way to contact him without Uncle Edmund finding out. Adrian pulled paper and pen toward him, writing quick notes. Whitmore might still have those duplicate records. If Edmund hasn't killed him yet, he might be willing to testify in exchange for protection and immunity. What about the servants who were dismissed, scattered across the country without references? Impossible to employ, probably desperate by now. If we could find them and offer something. I can find them, Adrian interrupted. I have investigators who specialize in locating people who don't want to be found. If they're alive, we'll find them. If they're not, we'll find evidence of what happened to them. He looked up from his notes to find Evelyn staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decode. Not trust? Not yet. But maybe the foundation of possibility. The first structural support of maybe this won't destroy me after all. You believe me, she said. And it wasn't quite a question. I believe the documents. I believe the bruises. I believe you're terrified, and that terror is based on experience rather than imagination. Whether that makes your uncle a monster or simply a very ambitious criminal, we'll discover. What if we can't prove it? What if he's covered his tracks too well? Adrian's expression went cold, the Iron Duke mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. Then we'll create circumstances where he makes a mistake. Ambitious men always do, eventually. They get confident, sloppy. And when your uncle gets sloppy, I'll be there to catch him. And if he tries to hurt me before then? The Duke met her eyes directly. Then he'll discover exactly why people call me cold. I didn't earn that reputation by being merciful to my enemies. It should have sounded like a threat. Instead, in the strange intimacy of that destroyed bridal chamber with evidence of conspiracy spread across the desk between them, it sounded almost like a promise. They worked through the night, Adrian questioning Evelyn about every detail she could remember. Dates, amounts, names of Edmund's business associates, patterns of behavior that might reveal weaknesses. By the time gray dawn light started seeping through the torn curtains, they had the skeleton of a plan. Adrian would have his investigators locate Thomas Whitmore and the dismissed servants immediately. Meanwhile, he'd invite Edmund to Blackthorn Manor for a dinner party in 2 weeks, ostensibly to celebrate the successful marriage alliance. During that visit, Adrian would probe Edmund's defenses, looking for cracks in his confidence. You're going to pretend everything is fine, Evelyn said slowly, understanding dawning. You're going to act like the marriage is exactly what he planned, trap him with his own success. He'll expect me to be focused on business integration, trade agreements, the practical benefits of our alliance. He won't expect me to care about you as anything other than an asset that came with the contract. That gives us operational advantage. Evelyn stood from where she'd been sitting cross-legged on the floor for hours, wincing as stiff muscles protested. The torn wedding dress hung off her frame like a ghost costume, ridiculous in the morning light. I should clean up, she said, gesturing vaguely at the destroyed room. The servants will talk if they see this. Let them talk. Adrian stood as well, rolling his shoulders to release tension. You're the new duchess. You're allowed to redecorate. We'll spin it as artistic temperament or some nonsense about the old furniture not matching your aesthetic. No one will question it. You've thought of everything. I usually do. It's a professional liability. For the first time since Adrian had entered the room, Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. I suppose I should thank you, she said awkwardly, for believing me, for helping. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. Your uncle is still free, Still in control of your fortune, still dangerous. All we've done is establish that we're opponents instead of accomplices. The actual fight hasn't started. But it will. Adrian nodded. It will. And Evelyn, when it does, I need you to be ready to be ruthless. Your uncle will use every emotional weapon he has. Family loyalty, social pressure, claims of hysteria or delusion. You'll need to be harder than he expects, colder than he believes possible. She lifted her chin, and Adrian saw something steel itself behind her eyes. I've been surviving him for 5 years, Your Grace. I know how to be hard. Good, he said. Because the woman who destroyed this room out of rage and terror, that woman is exactly who we need. Not the polite mask you wore during the wedding, not the obedient ward your uncle trained, the woman who's angry enough to fight back. Eveline looked at the destruction around them, at the evidence of her own breakdown transformed into strategy. Then she looked at Adrian, really looked at him, seeing perhaps for the first time not the Iron Duke of reputation, but the calculating mind underneath. I can do that, she said quietly. I can be angry. Adrian extended his hand again, this time not to help her stand, but to seal an agreement. Partners? She hesitated only a moment before gripping his hand firmly. Partners. They stood like that in the gray morning light, two people who barely knew each other, bound by a wedding neither had wanted and a conspiracy neither had expected. It wasn't romance, it wasn't even friendship, but it was the beginning of something neither of them had experienced in a long time. Alliance. Real alliance, not the political theater both had been performing their entire lives. The Duke released her hand and moved toward the door. Get some sleep, he said. We start working on this tomorrow night. Tonight, you recover. Where are you going? To my study, to start making the arrangements, and to send a message to your uncle, informing him how pleased I am with our marriage arrangement and how much I look forward to deepening our family ties. The irony in his voice made Evelyn's lips twitch. He'll believe you. Of course he will. I'm the Iron Duke. I don't care about anything except power and profit. That's what everyone knows, what everyone expects. And is it true? Adrian paused at the door, considering the question. Until about 6 hours ago, I would have said yes. Now I'm not entirely certain anymore. He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed quietly behind him. The hallway outside was empty, the servants having finally given up their vigil. Adrian walked back toward his own chambers with his mind already 3 moves ahead, planning contact strategies, calculating risk assessment, mapping the network of people he'd need to mobilize. But underneath the strategic planning, something else nagged at him. The image of Evelyn on the floor of that destroyed room, holding herself together through pure will. The way she'd flinched when he approached, expecting violence. The relief in her eyes when he offered help instead of harm. Adrian Blackthorne had spent 32 years building walls between himself and anything resembling genuine connection. He'd perfected the art of being untouchable, unreachable, safe. And in one night, a terrified woman with bruises on her wrist and a conspiracy in her past had found a crack in that armor. He wasn't sure yet whether that crack was a weakness or an opportunity. But he was certain of one thing, the thing that had been crystallizing in his mind since he'd first seen those bruises and heard Evelyn's confession. Edmund Ashford had made a catastrophic mistake. He delivered his victim directly to the one man who had the resources, the ruthlessness, and now, unexpectedly, the motivation to destroy him completely. Adrian reached his study and unlocked the private cabinet where he kept his most sensitive files. He pulled out a leather journal, opened to a blank page, and wrote a single line at the top. Project: The Ashford Problem. Below it, he began listing names, resources, strategies. The skeleton of a campaign that would either destroy Edmund Ashford or consume Adrian himself. By the time the sun fully rose over Blackthorne Manor, the Duke had filled 12 pages with neat, precise handwriting. Plans within plans. Contingencies for every possible outcome. And somewhere in the middle of those plans, he realized he'd stopped thinking of Evelyn as an asset or a contractual obligation. She'd become something more complicated, a person, an ally, someone whose survival had become entangled with his own reputation, and strangely, with something that felt almost like justice. Adrian closed the journal and locked it back in the cabinet. Then he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, drank it in one burning swallow, and allowed himself exactly 60 seconds to acknowledge the magnitude of what he'd just agreed to do. He was going to war. Not with armies or trade negotiations, but with reputation, social power, and legal manipulation. The kind of war that destroyed families and toppled empires when executed correctly. And he was doing it because a woman he'd known for less than a day had looked at him with desperate eyes and asked for nothing except the truth. The clock on his desk chimed 7 times. Somewhere in the manor, Evelyn was probably still awake, staring at the ceiling of that destroyed bridal chamber, wondering if Adrian's promises would dissolve with morning light, like every other promise made to her. He'd have to prove otherwise. Not with words, but with action. The Iron Duke poured himself another drink and got back to work. The household would be stirring soon. Servants to manage, appearances to maintain, a message to draft for Edmund Ashford that would sound congratulatory while laying the groundwork for his eventual destruction. Just another day of aristocratic responsibility. Except this time, the stakes felt different. This time, Adrian realized with something between alarm and dark amusement, he actually gave a damn about the outcome beyond his own strategic advantage. That was dangerous. That was unprecedented. That was absolutely going to get complicated. But as the Duke began drafting his letter to Lord Edmund Ashford, his hand steady and his mind calculating every word for maximum effect, he discovered he didn't care about the complication. Let it get messy. Let it get personal. Edmund Ashford wanted to play games with stolen fortunes and terrorized women? Fine. Adrian Blackthorne was about to teach him the difference between a man who inherited power and a man who'd learned to weaponize it. The letter began with traditional congratulations and ended with an invitation that read like courtesy but functioned as a summons. Edmund wouldn't be able to refuse without raising suspicion. He'd have to come to Blackthorne Manor, walk into Adrian's territory, and pretend everything was proceeding according to his plan. And while he pretended, Adrian would be systematically dismantling every support structure keeping Edmund's conspiracy intact. It would take time, patience, precision. Adrian had all 3 in abundance. He sealed the letter with his family crest, the black thorn pressed into red wax, and left it for his secretary to send. Then he finally allowed himself to walk to his bedroom, strip off the formal clothes he'd been wearing for 24 hours, and fall into bed. But even exhausted, sleep came slowly. His mind kept returning to that destroyed bridal chamber, to Evelyn's voice saying, "I didn't expect honesty," to the way she'd gripped his hand when they had agreed to partnership, like she was grabbing a lifeline and fully expected it to dissolve into smoke. She'd spent 5 years expecting betrayal, preparing for abandonment, surviving through pure stubbornness and the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, someone would eventually notice her suffering and give a damn. Now someone had noticed. Whether that would save her or destroy them both remained to be seen. Adrian closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, his last conscious thought forming like a prayer to whatever gods governed the ruthless world of aristocratic power. Let me be cold enough. Let me be calculating enough. Let me be exactly the monster they say I am, but aimed in the right direction for once. Because if I'm not, Edmund Ashford wins. And that woman sleeping in a destroyed room down the hall stays trapped in the nightmare she thought was ending. The sun continued rising outside, indifferent to the conspiracy being born in Blackthorne Manor's shadows. Servants began their morning routines. Somewhere in the city, Lord Edmund Ashford probably woke feeling satisfied, confident that his plan was complete and his enemy's new wife would never dare speak against him. He had no idea the Iron Duke had just declared a war he couldn't see coming. And that was exactly how Adrian wanted it. 3 days passed in careful theater. Adrian played the satisfied husband during public meals, discussing trade routes and textile contracts with the kind of detached precision that confirmed every rumor about the Iron Duke's priorities. Evelyn played the quiet wife, speaking when spoken to, smiling at appropriate moments, performing the role her uncle had trained her for. Only at night, behind locked doors in Adrian's study, did the performance drop. The investigators' reports arrived in sealed envelopes marked with codes only Adrian recognized. He spread them across his desk while Evelyn sat in the leather chair opposite, her posture rigid with the kind of tension that came from years of waiting for the next blow to fall. "Thomas Whitmore is still alive," Adrian said, scanning the first report. "Still working in Edmund's London office. Lives alone in a rented room near Cheapside. No family, few friends. My man observed him for 2 days. He's nervous. Looks over his shoulder constantly. Someone's threatened him recently. Can we trust him?" Evelyn's voice was steady, but her hands twisted together in her lap, betraying the fear underneath. Trust is the wrong word. We can use him. Fear makes people either collapse or cooperate. If we approach correctly, offer the right combination of protection and immunity, he'll talk. Adrian set down the first report and picked up the second. The dismissed servants are harder. 3 confirmed dead, 2 from illness that looks suspicious timing-wise. 1 in what the local magistrate called a tavern brawl, but my investigator thinks was staged. The others scattered across 5 counties. Most changed their names or left the country entirely. Mary? Evelyn's voice cracked slightly on the name of her disappeared maid. Adrian met her eyes directly. No confirmed body, but also no confirmed sighting in 3 months. The timeline matches what you told me. She left Ashford House to meet Whitmore, never arrived, never returned. Your uncle's people probably intercepted her. Probably. Almost certainly. Adrian's tone remained clinical, factual. He'd learned long ago that false comfort served no purpose. Better to acknowledge brutal reality than pretend it didn't exist. But here's the important detail. If they killed her, they were sloppy. My investigator found a witness who saw a woman matching Mary's description being forced into a carriage near the meeting location. If they'd wanted a clean disappearance, they would have done it differently. Which means she might be alive, held somewhere. Insurance against you ever speaking up. Evelyn's face went pale. If she's alive and we move against my uncle, he'll kill her. Use her as proof of what happens to people who help me. If she's alive and we don't move, she stays imprisoned until she's no longer useful, then disposed of. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying Evelyn's reaction. There's no clean option here. Every choice has casualties. The question is whether we accept your uncle's casualties or create our own strategy that might save more people in the long run. How is that a choice? How do I decide Mary's life is expendable for some theoretical future justice? You don't, Adrian said flatly. I do. That's what you hired me for when you showed me those documents, to make the calculations you can't stomach. So let me be clear. If we have to sacrifice Mary to take down Edmund, I will. If we can save her as part of the operation, I will. But her survival isn't the primary objective. Destroying your uncle is. Evelyn stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The study overlooked Blackthorn Manor's gardens, immaculate hedges and gravel paths illuminated by lamplight. Perfect order imposed on nature through constant maintenance and ruthless pruning. You're exactly what they say you are, she said to the glass. Cold. Calculating. The numbers matter more than the people. Yes. And you don't apologize for it. Why would I? Adrian rose and crossed to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. Sentiment doesn't win wars. Guilt doesn't protect assets. Your uncle understands that. He's built his entire conspiracy on the principle that most people are too squeamish to do what's actually necessary, too bound by ideas of fairness and mercy to take the ruthless action required. That's his advantage. He knows his opponents will hesitate. And you won't. Never. Adrian's reflection in the window showed no emotion, just the cold assessment of a general planning a campaign. But here's what your uncle doesn't know. I'm not just ruthless, I'm thorough. If there's a way to destroy him and save Mary, I'll find it. Not because I care about Mary personally, I never met the woman, but because maximum casualties mean maximum complications. Clean operations are efficient operations, so Mary's survival is just operational efficiency. Yes. Evelyn turned to face him directly. You're a bastard, Your Grace. I've been called worse, usually by people who lost negotiations with me. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, more like recognition. She'd spent 5 years surviving her uncle by learning to read the calculations of dangerous men. Adrian's brutal honesty was at least predictable, trustworthy in its complete lack of pretense. What's the next step? She asked. Contact Whitmore. Offer him a deal he can't refuse. Immunity from prosecution for any involvement in Edmund's schemes, protection from retaliation, and enough money to start over somewhere far from London. In exchange, he testifies to what he knows and provides copies of those duplicate records. And if he refuses, then we destroy his life methodically until cooperation looks like his best option. Adrian delivered this with the same tone he might use discussing dinner menus. I'd prefer cooperation. It's faster. But intimidation works too. You'd ruin an innocent clerk to get to my uncle. I'd ruin anyone necessary to complete the objective. That's what you need to understand, Evelyn. This isn't a moral crusade. It's a strategic operation. People who get caught in the machinery aren't victims of cruelty. They're casualties of efficiency. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment. The lamplight threw shadows across Adrian's face, emphasizing the sharp angles, the cold eyes, the complete absence of the warmth most people associated with humanity. "I think I might actually prefer this to kindness," she said quietly. "Why?" "Because kindness would be a lie. You'd pet my hair and promise everything would be fine, then make the same ruthless decisions anyway. At least this way I know exactly what I'm working with. A weapon aimed at my uncle instead of at me." Adrian felt that unfamiliar sensation again, the crack in his armor widening slightly. She actually understood the architecture of how he functioned. Most people recoiled from his coldness or tried to fix it, convinced that underneath the Ice Duke facade was a wounded soul waiting to be healed. Evelyn just accepted the weapon for what it was and decided to aim it. "Smart woman," he said. "Traumatized woman," she corrected. "There's a difference. Sometimes they're the same thing." A knock interrupted whatever response Evelyn might have made. Adrian crossed to the door and opened it to find his head of security, Marcus, holding another sealed envelope. "This just arrived, Your Grace. Special courier from Lord Ashford's estate. Marked urgent." Adrian took the envelope, noting the Ashford seal pressed into deep blue wax. He dismissed Marcus and returned to the desk, using his letter opener to slice it open cleanly. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery covered in Edmund Ashford's elaborate handwriting. Adrian read it once quickly, then again slowly, analyzing each word for hidden meaning. "Your uncle has invited himself to visit in 5 days instead of 2 weeks," he said. "Claims he has urgent business matters to discuss regarding the integration of our estates. Wants to review account books and finalize trade agreements." Evelyn went rigid. "That's too soon. We're not ready." "On the contrary." Adrian set the letter down carefully. "This is perfect. Edmund thinks he's applying pressure, forcing the pace before we can establish independent patterns. He's anxious. Probably heard rumors that I've been asking questions about Ashford estate management. He wants to control the narrative before it gets away from him, or he wants to see if I've said anything to you. That too." Adrian pulled fresh paper toward him and began drafting a response, "Which means we need to stage this perfectly. When Edmund arrives, everything needs to confirm his assumptions. I'm the cold businessman focused on profit margins. You're the traumatized wife who hasn't dared to speak against him. He walks away confident that his plan is secure, while we're actually building the case against him." "Exactly." Adrian's pen moved across the paper in neat, precise lines. "But we'll need to accelerate the timeline. 5 days to contact Whitmore, secure his cooperation, and position him for testimony. Can your uncle's spy network track us that fast?" "He doesn't have a spy network. He has money and intimidation. Most people just tell him things because they're too scared not to. Different mechanism, same result." Adrian sealed his response and set it aside for morning dispatch. "We'll use coded communications with Whitmore. Meet in public places where surveillance is difficult. And Evelyn, you need to prepare for your uncle's visit psychologically. He's going to test you, push boundaries, try to reassert control. I know how my uncle operates, Your Grace. I'm sure you do. But knowing and enduring are different skills. If he suspects you've turned against him, everything falls apart. So when he arrives, you'll need to be the terrified ward again. Flinch at the right moments. Defer to his authority. Make him believe the wedding changed nothing about your relationship." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. "You're asking me to let him win. I'm asking you to let him think he's winning. There's a difference." "To you, maybe. To me, it feels like being back in that cellar room he showed me." Adrian stopped writing and looked at her directly. "Then don't go back there mentally. Go somewhere else. Pretend you're an actress playing a role. Pretend it's strategic theater instead of survival. Whatever mental framework lets you endure 5 days of performance art. And if I can't, then we lose. Edmund walks away with your fortune and his freedom, and you spend the rest of your life trapped in this manor wondering if you could have been brave enough to destroy him." Adrian's tone remained brutally matter-of-fact. "I won't force you to do this, but I also won't pretend there are easy options. There aren't. There's terrifying and effective, or comfortable and useless. Choose." Evelyn moved to the sidebar and poured herself a drink from Adrian's crystal decanter. expensive brandy that burned going down but settled something in her chest. She drank half the glass in one swallow, then turned back to face him. I'll do it. I'll perform for my uncle. But Adrian, when this is over, when he's been exposed and destroyed and he's standing there realizing everything he built is collapsing, I want to be there. I want to see his face. Granted, Adrian said immediately. You've earned that front row seat. She finished the brandy and set the glass down with more force than necessary. Then let's begin. The next morning, Adrian sent his most trusted investigator to London with instructions to locate Thomas Whitmore and arrange a meeting. The message was carefully worded. An opportunity to correct past injustices, protection offered, discretion guaranteed. Whitmore was too frightened to respond immediately. Adrian's man reported that the clerk received the message, went pale, and spent the next 6 hours looking over his shoulder before finally sending a reply agreeing to meet at a coffeehouse near St. Paul's Cathedral at dawn the following day. Public location, Adrian noted when the report arrived. Smart. He thinks crowds offer safety. Do they? Evelyn asked. From physical violence, yes. From legal or social pressure, no. Which is why I'm going personally. You? Evelyn looked startled. That's not safe. It's calculated risk. If I send intermediaries, Whitmore might believe it's a trap set by Edmund. If I go myself, it demonstrates commitment. And yes, before you ask, I'll bring security. Marcus and 3 others in civilian clothes positioned throughout the area. What do you need from me? Stay here. Continue the performance of the dutiful wife. Your uncle has informants throughout London. If anyone reports seeing you near that coffee house, he'll know something's wrong. Evelyn nodded reluctantly. What will you offer Whitmore? The truth. That Edmund Ashford is a thief and murderer who will eventually eliminate everyone who knows about his schemes. That cooperating with me is his only chance at survival. And if truth doesn't work, I'll escalate to more persuasive measures. Meaning? Adrian smiled without warmth. Meaning I'll explain exactly how thoroughly I can destroy his life if he refuses. Job prospects eliminated, housing connections severed, social reputation demolished. The kind of total annihilation that makes cooperation look like mercy. You're good at this. I've had practice. Adrian left Blackthorn Manor before dawn, traveling in an unmarked carriage with Marcus beside him and 3 additional security personnel following at a discreet distance. The London streets were still mostly empty, just early laborers and delivery wagons making their rounds. The coffeehouse near St. Paul's catered to clerks and minor functionaries, the kind of establishment where men discussed business over weak tea and stale pastries. Adrian arrived 20 minutes early and secured a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances. Marcus positioned himself near the main door while the others spread throughout the surrounding area. Thomas Whitmore arrived exactly on time, which told Adrian something useful about the man's psychology. Punctual people craved order and predictability. They could be reasoned with because they responded to structure. The clerk was younger than Adrian expected, maybe 30, with the perpetually nervous demeanor of someone who'd witnessed things he wished he could forget. He spotted Adrian immediately, the Duke's expensive clothes and commanding presence impossible to miss, even in civilian attire, and hesitated before crossing to the table. Mr. Whitmore, Adrian said quietly, thank you for meeting me. I'm not sure I should be here, Whitmore replied, but he sat anyway. His hands trembled slightly as he ordered coffee from the serving girl. You're here because you know what Lord Ashford is doing is wrong, and you're terrified of what happens if you speak up, Adrian said bluntly. I'm here to offer you a third option between complicity and martyrdom. Whitmore's coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup like it might anchor him to something solid. What kind of option? Immunity, protection, and enough money to start fresh somewhere Edmund can't touch you. In exchange, you testify about the financial records you've been keeping and provide me copies of documentation proving Edmund's embezzlement and fraud. The clerk went even paler. If I do that, I'm dead. Lord Ashford has people everywhere. He has people who work for money and fear, Adrian corrected. I have resources that run deeper, and here's what you need to understand about your current situation. Edmund will kill you anyway, eventually. You're a liability. Everyone who knows about his schemes is. He's probably already planning how to eliminate you once the marriage settlement is fully processed. That's not... he wouldn't. Whitmore's protest died as he realized he didn't believe his own words. He absolutely would, Adrian said. You've seen what he's capable of. The servants who disappeared. The woman he had killed in that staged tavern brawl. You think he values your life more than theirs? Whitmore's hands tightened around the coffee cup. He had people killed? Don't insult either of us by pretending you didn't know. You kept duplicate records specifically because you suspected what Edmund was doing. You're not naive, Mr. Whitmore. You're trapped, and right now I'm offering you a way out. The clerk stared into his coffee like it might contain answers. Why should I trust you? Everyone says you're as ruthless as Lord Ashford. I am, Adrian agreed. But my ruthlessness is aimed at Edmund, not at you. You're useful to me alive and cooperative. To him, you're only useful silent and eventually dead. The mathematics are simple. What about Lady Evelyn? Whitmore looked up suddenly. Is she safe? That maid who tried to help her, Mary, she said Lady Evelyn was in real danger. Evelyn is under my protection now. Adrian's tone shifted, becoming harder, which is why I need your testimony. Her uncle has spent years terrorizing her, stealing from her, and eliminating anyone who tried to intervene. That ends now. But I can't destroy him without evidence that will stand up to legal scrutiny. And if I provide that evidence, you guarantee my safety? I guarantee that Edmund Ashford will be too busy fighting for his own survival to come after you. Whether that constitutes safety depends on your definition. Whitmore almost laughed, a bitter sound. You really don't make this easy. Easy is an illusion. There's calculated risk or certain doom. Choose. The clerk sat silent for a long moment, weighing options, calculating odds, probably praying to whatever god he still believed in after working for Edmund Ashford. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. These are copies of the duplicate records I've been keeping. Account transfers, forged documents, correspondence between Lord Ashford and his business partners discussing the liquidation of assets that should have gone to Lady Evelyn. It's not everything, but it's enough to prove the pattern. Adrian took the papers without looking at them immediately. Where are the originals? In a safe deposit box at Coots Bank under a false name. If anything happens to me, they'll be released to the authorities automatically. Smart. Adrian finally examined the documents, scanning quickly but thoroughly. This is good, detailed, damning, but I'll need you to testify in person when the time comes. When? 5 days. Edmund is visiting Blackthorn Manor to review the marriage settlement. I'm going to let him believe everything is proceeding as planned, then spring the trap with witnesses, documentation, and enough legal pressure that he can't escape. He'll run, Whitmore said. As soon as he senses danger, he'll flee the country. Not if I arrest his assets first. Adrian folded the papers carefully. I have contacts in the Treasury and the Exchequer. By the time Edmund realizes he's exposed, his money will be frozen and his escape routes closed. You've thought of everything. That's my reputation. Adrian signaled Marcus, who brought a small leather case to the table. This contains £500 in cash, enough to secure lodging and supplies for the next week. Stay in London, but change your address daily. Don't follow patterns. Marcus will check in every evening at 7 Bells at the Mermaid Tavern on Cheapside. If you're in danger or need to relocate, tell him. On the day of Edmund's visit to Blackthorn Manor, a carriage will collect you at dawn. You'll testify before witnesses, provide the documents, and then you'll be escorted to a ship bound for Boston with enough funds to establish yourself permanently. America. Far enough that Edmund's reach doesn't extend. New identity if you want it. Fresh start. Whitmore took the case with trembling hands. I never wanted any of this. I just needed a job. No one wakes up planning to become part of a conspiracy, Adrian said. But here we are. Now the question is whether you're brave enough to help end it. The clerk stood, clutching the case. I'll be there. 5 days. Dawn collection. One more thing, Adrian said before Whitmore could leave. The maid, Mary. Do you know what happened to her? Whitmore's face crumpled. Lord Ashford's men intercepted her before we could meet. I heard later they took her to one of his properties outside London, an old hunting lodge he uses for people he needs to control. Is she alive? I don't know. I'm sorry. I should have protected her better. You should have, Adrian agreed coldly. But guilt serves no purpose now. If she's alive, we'll find her when we raid Edmund's properties after his arrest. If she's not, we'll add murder to his charges. Whitmore left without another word, disappearing into the morning crowd outside. Adrian remained seated, reading through the documents more carefully now. Every page confirmed what Evelyn had told him: systematic embezzlement, forged transfers, correspondence that revealed Edmund's absolute contempt for both the law and his niece. It was perfect. Comprehensive enough to destroy Edmund legally while being specific enough to verify independently. Marcus approached once Whitmore was safely clear. Did he cooperate? Completely. Adrian tucked the documents inside his coat. He'll testify. Now we need to accelerate the other preparations. I want Edmund's assets frozen the day before he arrives at Blackthorn Manor. He needs to walk into that trap with no warning and no escape route. I'll send word to your treasury contacts immediately. And Marcus, increase security around Evelyn. If Edmund suspects anything, he might try to reclaim her before we can act. Understood, Your Grace. They left the coffee house separately, Adrian returning to his unmarked carriage while Marcus and the security team maintained surveillance to ensure no one had followed Whitmore. The ride back to Blackthorn Manor took 2 hours, giving Adrian time to review the documents again and plan the next phase. When he arrived home, he found Evelyn in the conservatory, surrounded by plants she was pretending to care about while actually staring at nothing. She looked up when Adrian entered, hope and fear warring in her expression. He cooperated, Adrian said without preamble. Full documentation, agreement to testify, everything we need. Evelyn sagged with relief. Thank God. Thank calculation and self-interest. Adrian handed her the documents. Your uncle's been even more thorough than we suspected. Whitmore has records going back 8 years. Every fraudulent transaction, every forged authorization, every penny stolen. She read through them with shaking hands. This is enough. This is more than enough. For the legal case, yes. But Evelyn, there's something else. Adrian moved to stand beside her, keeping his voice low despite the empty conservatory. Whitmore mentioned Mary. She was intercepted before their meeting. Taken to a hunting lodge Edmund owns outside London. Her eyes went wide. She's alive? Unknown. But the property exists, and Edmund uses it for people he wants to control or interrogate. When we move against him, I'll have that lodge raided simultaneously. If Mary's there, we'll get her out. If she's alive, Evelyn whispered. Yes. Adrian didn't soften the reality. If she's alive. Evelyn set the documents aside and pressed both hands to her face. All those people. All those years. And he just kept destroying lives because he could. That's what unchecked power does. Adrian's tone remained clinical. Your uncle learned early that most people are too afraid or too polite to stop him. So he kept escalating, kept taking more, kept believing he was untouchable. And now? Now he learns he was wrong. Adrian retrieved the documents and locked them in the conservatory's concealed safe. 4 more days until he arrives. We use that time to finalize every detail, freeze his assets, position witnesses, ensure law enforcement is ready to move, and you practice being the terrified ward one last time. Evelyn lowered her hands, her expression hardening. I can do that. I've had years of practice. I know. But this time is different. This time you'll know that every flinch, every submission, every moment of performed fear is part of destroying him. Let that knowledge make you strong enough to endure it. She nodded slowly. And when it's over, when he's been arrested and exposed, then you become whoever you want to be without his shadow over everything. Adrian turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. When Edmund arrives, he'll probably try to speak with you privately, away from me. He'll want to reassure himself that you're still under his control, and I'll have to convince him I am. Yes, which means enduring whatever intimidation he employs. Can you do that without breaking? Evelyn met his eyes directly. I've survived worse from him. I can survive one more performance. Good. Because if he suspects anything, he'll run. And if he runs, we might never get another chance to take him down. He won't suspect, she said firmly. I'll make sure of it. The next 4 days unfolded with military precision. Adrian's treasury contacts froze Edmund's primary accounts under investigation for irregularities. His investigators positioned themselves at every Ashford property, ready to raid simultaneously. Marcus coordinated with local magistrates who owed the Blackthorn family favors, ensuring legal authority to arrest Edmund the moment testimony concluded. And through it all, Evelyn practiced. Practiced the flinch when addressed sharply. Practiced the downcast eyes and quiet voice. Practiced becoming the trapped woman her uncle expected to find. even while her mind catalogued every detail of the trap they were building around him. On the fourth evening, Adrian found her in his study reviewing the timeline one last time. Tomorrow morning, Thomas Whitmore would be collected and brought to a secure location near Blackthorn Manor. Tomorrow afternoon, Edmund would arrive expecting routine business discussions. Tomorrow evening, the trap would spring with everyone in position. "Are you ready?" Adrian asked from the doorway. "Adrian?" Eveline looked up, and for just a moment her mask slipped. Underneath the practiced calm, he saw raw terror. Not of Edmund anymore, but of hope. The desperate fear that maybe this time things really would change. "I don't know how to be ready for this," she admitted. "If it works, everything I've endured has meaning. If it fails, I've risked everything for nothing." Adrian crossed to stand beside her desk. "It won't fail. I don't allow failures. You can't control everything. No. But I can control enough. Your uncle thinks he's walking into a friendly negotiation. He has no idea he's walking into an ambush. That ignorance is our advantage." Eveline stood, and before Adrian could anticipate it, she wrapped her arms around him in a brief, fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for believing me." Adrian stood frozen for a second, his body registering the contact before his mind caught up. He wasn't accustomed to being touched without calculation behind it. Every embrace in his adult life had been strategic, transactional, or obligatory. This felt different, genuine, desperate. He awkwardly patted her shoulder, then stepped back, reestablishing professional distance. "Don't thank me yet. We haven't won. But we're fighting. That's more than I had 4 days ago." Adrian wanted to say something reassuring, something about justice or righteousness, or the inevitable triumph of good over evil. But those were lies, and he'd promised her honesty. So instead he said, "Tomorrow your uncle learns what happens when he underestimates his enemies. Make sure you're in position to watch." "I will be," she promised. They stood there in the study's lamplight, two people bound by conspiracy and necessity, waiting for dawn and the beginning of the war neither could afford to lose. Outside, the city slept. Inside Blackthorn Manor, preparations continued through the night. Security positioned, documents secured, witnesses briefed. And in his private chambers, Adrian Blackthorn stood at the window watching darkness give way to gray dawn, thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go catastrophically wrong. Edmund might suspect the trap. He might bring his own security force. He might have legal countermeasures Adrian hadn't anticipated. Or it might work exactly as planned. The Duke finished his whiskey, set the glass aside, and prepared for war. Because in 6 hours, Lord Edmund Ashford would walk through the doors of Blackthorn Manor expecting a celebration of his successful conspiracy. Instead, he was about to discover that the Iron Duke had spent 4 days building the perfect cage around him. And cages, once sprung, were very difficult to escape. Dawn arrived with this kind of gray light that made everything look washed out and unreal. Adrian stood in his study watching the gravel drive, coffee growing cold in his hand, waiting for the carriage that would deliver Thomas Whitmore to the secure room where he'd remain until testimony time. Everything was positioned, every piece aligned. The trap was perfect, which was exactly when Adrian should have known something was catastrophically wrong. The carriage arrived 15 minutes late. Not unusual given London traffic, but Adrian's instincts prickled anyway. Marcus met the vehicle at the side entrance as planned, then appeared in the study doorway with an expression Adrian had never seen on his head of security's face before. Pure confusion. "Your Grace, we have a problem." Adrian set down his coffee with deliberate care. "Where's Whitmore?" "He's here. But there's someone with him. Someone who insisted on coming." Marcus stepped aside and a woman entered the study. Small, dark-haired, visibly terrified, but holding herself together through what looked like sheer stubbornness. Eveline appeared in the connecting doorway from her chambers, took one look at the woman, and made a sound between a gasp and a sob. Mary, the maid who had disappeared 3 months ago, looked like she'd aged a decade. Thinner, with the kind of exhaustion that came from extended trauma, but alive. Impossibly, miraculously alive. Adrian's mind raced through implications. This changed everything. Mary was supposed to be dead or permanently disappeared, her fate a symbol of Edmund's reach. Her presence here meant either Edmund's control was slipping or something else was happening that Adrian hadn't anticipated. "How?" Eveline whispered, crossing to grip Mary's hands. "How are you here?" "Mr. Whitmore found me," Mary said, her voice rough like she hadn't used it properly in months. 2 days ago, he'd been searching Edmund's properties, trying to find evidence. Found me locked in that hunting lodge instead. Adrian looked at Marcus. Where's Whitmore now? Waiting in the secure room as instructed. He wanted me to bring Mary to you first, said you needed to hear what she knows before Lord Ashford arrives. The prickling instinct intensified. Adrian had specifically told Whitmore to stay hidden, stay safe, don't take risks. Searching Edmund's properties was the opposite of that instruction. It suggested either remarkable bravery or something more complicated. Bring Whitmore here, Adrian said. Now. Marcus left. Evelyn was still holding Mary's hands, tears streaming down her face, overcome by relief and confusion. Adrian watched them both, his strategic mind trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle he'd constructed. It didn't fit. The shape was wrong. Thomas Whitmore entered looking even more nervous than he had at the coffee house, if that was possible. He kept glancing at Mary, then at Adrian, then at the floor like he couldn't maintain eye contact with anyone. Mr. Whitmore? Adrian said quietly. Explain why you disobeyed my explicit instructions to remain hidden. I couldn't leave her there, Whitmore said. After I gave you the documents, I kept thinking about what you said, that everyone who knew about Lord Ashford's schemes was a liability, that he'd kill them eventually. And I realized Mary was the biggest liability of all because she'd tried to help Lady Eveline directly. So you decided to mount a rescue operation. I know it was stupid. I know it risked everything. But, Your Grace, I've spent 8 years watching Lord Ashford destroy people while I kept my head down and pretended not to notice. I couldn't do it anymore. Not after finally deciding to fight back. It should have been noble. It should have been the kind of moral courage Adrian claimed to respect even if he didn't practice it himself. But something about Whitmore's delivery felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech. Adrian crossed to where Mary stood. Tell me what happened. Everything. Start from the night you left Ashford House to meet Whitmore. Mary's eyes darted to Evelyn, seeking permission or reassurance. Evelyn nodded, still holding one of Mary's hands. I left through the servants' entrance after midnight, Mary began. Walked to the meeting location near St. Paul's. But before I got there, men grabbed me, forced me into a carriage. I thought they were Lord Ashford's people. They had his house colors. But something felt wrong. Wrong how? They were too professional, too organized. Lord Ashford's usual men are thugs he hires from the docks. These men moved like soldiers, like they'd done this before. Adrian felt ice forming in his chest. Where did they take you? The hunting lodge, like Mr. Whitmore said, but not to a dungeon or anything horrific. To a room, plain but not cruel. They fed me. Let me wash. Kept me there but didn't hurt me. Just kept me there. For 3 months. Yes. Mary's voice dropped. I thought I was being held until Lord Ashford decided what to do with me, but no one questioned me, no one threatened me. They just kept me in that room like I was being stored. Adrian turned to Whitmore. And you found her how, exactly? I bribed one of Lord Ashford's junior clerks, got a list of properties he owns under various names, searched them systematically. The hunting lodge was the 4th location. That must have taken considerable resources, time, money, information networks. For a frightened clerk making a junior salary, it seemed remarkably efficient. I used the money you gave me, Whitmore said quickly. And I got lucky. Luck, Adrian repeated. He looked at Marcus. Searched them both, thoroughly. Marcus moved immediately, professional and thorough. Whitmore protested but submitted. Mary looked confused but allowed it. And in the lining of Whitmore's coat, Marcus found a sealed letter marked with a crest Adrian recognized immediately. The Royal Exchequer. Government seal. Marcus handed it to Adrian, who broke the seal and read quickly. His face remained impassive, but internally, everything was collapsing. The letter was addressed to Thomas Whitmore, clerk, from the office of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It thanked him for his continued cooperation in the investigation of Adrian Blackthorne, Duke, for suspected financial crimes including tax evasion, illegal trade practices, and conspiracy to defraud the Crown. The investigation of Adrian Blackthorne. Not Edmund Ashford, Adrian Blackthorne. The room went silent except for the sound of Adrian's pulse pounding in his ears. He read the letter again, forcing himself to process what it actually said versus what he'd expected to find. Someone had been investigating him. For months, probably longer. And Thomas Whitmore had been cooperating with that investigation while simultaneously pretending to help Adrian take down Edmund. Adrian looked up slowly, his expression carefully neutral, and met Whitmore's eyes. The clerk had gone pale, realizing he'd been discovered. "I can explain," Whitmore started. "No need," Adrian interrupted. "It's very clear. You've been working with the Exchequer to build a case against me. The documents you provided about Edmund's embezzlement were real, but they weren't your primary objective. You were gathering intelligence on my financial dealings, my business practices, my vulnerabilities. Edmund's conspiracy was just the entry point. Whitmore's silence confirmed it. Evelyn made a small sound of confusion. "I don't understand. Thomas was helping us. Thomas was using us," Adrian corrected, still looking at the clerk. "The question is why? What possible interest does the Crown have in investigating me? I pay my taxes. My business dealings are legally aggressive but not criminal. Unless—" The realization hit like a physical blow. Unless someone convinced them I was involved in Edmund's schemes. Someone suggested that the marriage between myself and Evelyn wasn't about strategic alliance, but about helping Edmund hide stolen assets. That I was complicit in the embezzlement, the murder, all of it. And that someone provided just enough evidence to make the Exchequer believe it was worth investigating. "Edmund," Evelyn whispered. "My uncle set this up, not just Edmund," Adrian said quietly. "This requires more sophistication than your uncle possesses. This requires understanding how government investigations work, how to manipulate bureaucratic machinery, how to aim the Crown's enforcement apparatus at a specific target." "Victor," Evelyn said suddenly. Her voice shook. "My cousin Victor. He works in the Treasury. He has access to the Exchequer offices." Adrian's mind raced backward through every interaction with Victor Ashford. The careful neutrality, the odd phrasing during their conversation on the wedding night. Your uncle negotiated this marriage like a man trying to close a deal before the other party discovers a problem with the merchandise. Victor had been warning him. Subtly, carefully, trying to signal that something was wrong without overtly betraying his own family. But not warning him about Edmund's conspiracy against Evelyn, warning him that Adrian himself was walking into a trap. "Mr. Whitmore," Adrian said, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that made experienced negotiators nervous, "did Victor Ashford recruit you to cooperate with the Crown investigation?" Whitmore looked at Mary, then at Evelyn, then finally at Adrian. "Yes, 6 months ago. He approached me with evidence that Lord Ashford was stealing from Lady Evelyn's inheritance. But he said the best way to stop it was to prove you were complicit, that you'd knowingly married into a criminal enterprise to profit from it. And you believed him?" "I believed the documents he showed me. Your business dealings with some of Lord Ashford's trade partners. Your signature on contracts that looked like they were designed to hide asset transfers. It all seemed real, because Victor forged them," Adrian said. "He's been building a false case against me while Edmund focused on controlling Evelyn. 2 fronts of attack, perfectly coordinated. Edmund keeps his niece terrorized and compliant. Victor aims the government at me. And together they ensure that even if the truth about Edmund's embezzlement comes out, I'm too compromised to help Evelyn fight back." It was elegant, vicious. The kind of conspiracy that required patience and sophisticated understanding of both legal systems and human psychology. Edmund might be a thief and murderer, but Victor was something worse. Victor was smart. Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Your Grace, I didn't know any of this. They kept me in that room, but a few days ago someone came. Not one of the guards. A gentleman. He said I'd be released soon, that someone would find me and bring me to you, and that I should tell you everything I knew about Lady Evelyn's situation. He said it would help. Describe him. Tall, well-dressed, polite, dark hair with gray at the temples. He had kind eyes." "Victor," Evelyn confirmed. "That's Victor." Adrian walked to the window, his back to the room, needing a moment to think without everyone watching his reaction. The entire structure he'd built over the past 4 days was compromised. Whitmore's testimony was tainted because he was a government informant. The documents he'd provided were real, but legally problematic because they'd been obtained through a parallel investigation of Adrian himself. And Mary's rescue wasn't a rescue at all. It was staged to add emotional weight to testimony that would ultimately incriminate Adrian as much as Edmund. Every piece he'd positioned to destroy Edmund could be turned and used to destroy Adrian instead. and Edmund would arrive in less than 4 hours expecting to negotiate trade agreements, completely unaware that both his brother-in-law and the government were maneuvering around him. Or was he aware? Had Victor kept Edmund in the dark? Or were they truly coordinating? Your Grace, Marcus said quietly from the doorway, we have another problem. 2 carriages just turned onto the drive. One is Lord Ashford's, expected. The other bears government crests. Exchequer officials. Adrian's jaw tightened. They're moving now. Victor must have informed them that Edmund would be here today. They're planning to arrest us both simultaneously. 2 criminals, 1 sweep. Very efficient. Evelyn crossed to stand beside him at the window. What do we do? Adrian stared at the approaching carriages, his mind calculating options at speed. He could run, but that would confirm guilt and destroy his reputation forever. He could fight, but fighting government officials was treason. He could try to negotiate, but what leverage did he have when Victor had spent 6 months building a case designed specifically to neutralize him? The Iron Duke, famous for always having a plan, for never being caught unprepared, for calculating every angle and controlling every variable, completely outmaneuvered. Tell me something, Adrian said, still watching the carriages. When did you realize you were being used, Mr. Whitmore? The clerk was silent for a long moment. This morning. When I read that letter before hiding it, I'd been carrying it for 2 days, instructions from Victor about what to say and when. But this morning I actually read it properly, saw how they'd positioned you as the primary target, realized that everything I thought I was doing to help Lady Evelyn was actually destroying the one person who might actually protect her. A bit late for that revelation. I know. Whitmore's voice cracked. I'm sorry. I thought I was serving justice. I didn't understand I was just a weapon aimed at the wrong target. Adrian finally turned from the window. Marcus, secure Whitmore and Mary in separate rooms. I want them isolated until I determine what to do with them. Then assemble the household staff. If government officials are entering Blackthorn Manor, I want witnesses to every word spoken. And me? Evelyn asked. What do you need me to do? Stay close. When they question you, and they will, tell the absolute truth about your uncle's crimes. Don't try to protect me. If they believe I'm complicit in Edmund's schemes, defending me will only make you look guilty too. But you're not guilty. You were trying to help me. The law doesn't care about intention, only evidence. And right now the evidence says I knowingly entered a business arrangement with a known criminal. Victor made sure of that. The carriages pulled up to the entrance. Adrian watched Edmund Ashford descend first, looking confident and satisfied, clearly expecting a productive meeting about trade integration. Then the Exchequer officials emerged, 4 of them, led by a senior investigator whose reputation Adrian knew by name. Harrison Webb, the man who'd personally dismantled 3 aristocratic financial empires in the past decade. This wasn't a preliminary investigation. This was an arrest operation. Adrian straightened his coat, checked his appearance in the window's reflection, and forced his expression into the cold neutrality that had served him through countless difficult negotiations. If he was going down, he'd do it on his feet, maintaining dignity even as everything collapsed. Marcus returned. They're requesting entry. Official capacity. Admit them to the formal receiving room. I'll be there momentarily. Adrian turned to Evelyn one last time. Whatever happens in the next hour, remember what you told me about your uncle? The bruises, the threats, the cellar room, that's real. That's documented. Even if they arrest me, even if Victor's fabricated evidence sticks, the truth about Edmund's abuse of you doesn't change. She grabbed his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since that brief embrace the night before. You saved me. You believed me when no one else would. I tried to save you, Adrian corrected. Whether I succeeded or just complicated everything remains to be seen. He walked toward the receiving room with Evelyn beside him and Marcus following at a professional distance. The manor's grand hallway suddenly felt like a gauntlet, every step bringing him closer to a confrontation he couldn't control through normal means. Edmund stood in the receiving room examining a portrait when Adrian entered. The older man turned with a practiced smile that died when he saw Adrian's expression and the government officials flanking him. Your Grace, what's the meaning of this? Edmund's confusion seemed genuine. Harrison Webb stepped forward, producing official documentation. Lord Edmund Ashford and Duke Adrian Blackthorn, I am here under authority of the Crown to place you both under investigation for financial crimes, conspiracy to defraud, and in Lord Ashford's case, suspicion of murder. You are required to submit to questioning and provide full accounting of your business dealings, asset transfers, and correspondence related to the Ashford-Blackthorne marriage arrangement. Edmund's face went from confusion to outrage. This is preposterous. I came here for business discussions, not to be accused of crimes by some bureaucrat. The evidence suggests otherwise, Webb said calmly. He gestured, and two junior officials began unrolling documents across the receiving room's massive table. Adrian recognized some of them from Whitmore's collection, but others were new. Forged contracts bearing Adrian's signature. Correspondence between Adrian and Edmund that Adrian had never written. A paper trail carefully constructed to make it look like they'd been conspiring together for months. Victor's work. Thorough and damning. I've never seen these documents, Adrian said flatly. Half of these signatures are forgeries. A claim we hear frequently, Webb replied, which is why we'll be conducting a full forensic analysis. In the meantime, both of your estates are under Crown supervision pending resolution of the investigation. You can't do that, Edmund sputtered. I have business operations, contracts, obligations, which will be managed by Crown-appointed administrators until this matter is resolved. Webb's tone suggested he'd had this conversation many times before and found it tedious. Adrian watched Edmund's performance with detached interest. The outrage seemed real, which meant Victor probably had kept his older brother ignorant of the government investigation. Edmund had thought he was winning, thought his conspiracy to steal Evelyn's inheritance and neutralize Adrian through marriage was proceeding perfectly. Instead, his younger brother had been systematically positioning him for arrest while simultaneously destroying Adrian's ability to intervene. It was actually impressive in a horrifying way. The door opened and Victor Ashford entered, his expression carefully concerned. He looked at Edmund, then at Adrian, then at the government officials with perfectly calibrated surprise. "What's happening here?" Victor asked. "I received word there was an emergency involving my family." Webb turned to him. "Mr. Ashford, your timing is convenient. We'll need your testimony regarding the financial arrangements between your brother and the Duke." "Of course," Victor said smoothly. "I want to cooperate fully. My family's reputation depends on clearing up any misunderstandings." "There's no misunderstanding," Adrian said quietly. "Is there, Victor? You've spent months building this case, manipulating evidence, aiming the government at both your brother and me. The only question is why?" Victor's mask of concern remained perfect. "Your Grace, I have no idea what you're referring to. If there are irregularities in my brother's business dealings, I'm as shocked as anyone." Edmund stared at his younger brother. "Victor, what is he talking about?" "He's talking about the fact that you murdered my father to steal control of the family fortune," Evelyn said suddenly. Her voice shook but held steady. "And Victor's been helping you hide it while simultaneously positioning himself to inherit everything once both of you were arrested and disgraced." The room went silent. Victor's expression finally cracked, just slightly. "Lady Evelyn, you're distraught. The trauma of recent events has obviously affected your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Evelyn shot back. "You stood by for 5 years while Edmund terrorized me. You could have stopped him at any time with your government connections, but you didn't, because you were waiting for the perfect moment to take control yourself. You need Edmund arrested to remove him from the inheritance line, and you need Adrian compromised so there's no powerful ally to challenge you. Then everything falls to you as the only surviving Ashford male with clean hands and government backing." Adrian felt something click into place. It wasn't just a conspiracy against Edmund. It wasn't just an attack on Adrian. It was a three-dimensional chess game where Victor had positioned everyone else to destroy each other while he remained untouchable. "Mr. Webb," Adrian said carefully, "I suggest you examine Victor Ashford's financial records as thoroughly as you're examining ours. I believe you'll find he's been systematically transferring assets out of the Ashford estate for years. Small amounts, easily missed, but adding up to a considerable fortune. Money he's been hiding in foreign accounts while letting his brother take the blame for the missing funds." Victor's composure slipped further. "That's absurd. I'm a treasury clerk. I have no access to the family fortune." "You had access through Edmund," Adrian continued. "He trusted you. Probably the only person he did trust. You handled administrative details, managed correspondence, coordinated business dealings. And you used that access to steal even more efficiently than Edmund did. Because you understood the systems designed to catch thieves. You knew exactly how to evade them. Webb looked at Victor with new interest. Is this true? Of course not. Victor's voice rose slightly. This is a desperate man trying to deflect blame onto anyone convenient. Then you won't mind submitting to the same financial audit you've recommended for your brother and the Duke, Webb said. It was phrased as a statement, not a question. Victor's eyes darted to the door, calculating escape routes. But Marcus stood there with two other security personnel, blocking exit. And in that moment of hesitation, Adrian saw Victor realize his carefully constructed plan was unraveling. Marcus, Adrian said quietly, the safe in my study. The hidden compartment behind the portrait. Bring me what's inside. Marcus left immediately. Adrian had gambled that Victor wouldn't resist direct physical confrontation with security present, and the gamble paid off. Victor remained frozen, his mind probably racing through options, none of them good. What's in your safe? Webb asked. Insurance, Adrian replied. 3 months ago, Victor approached me privately, suggested we could work together to manage the Ashford estate after Edmund's inevitable scandal. I declined, but found the conversation interesting enough to have it investigated. My people have been tracking Victor's financial movements since then. What Marcus is retrieving is documentation of every illegal transfer Victor's made, every hidden account, every penny he's stolen while pretending to be the responsible family member. It was a bluff. Adrian had no such documentation. But Victor didn't know that, and the man's expression confirmed guilt more effectively than any evidence could. You're lying, Victor said, but his voice carried no conviction. Test me. Let Webb examine my safe. If I'm lying, I'll submit to immediate arrest without contest. If I'm telling the truth, you'll spend the next decade in prison alongside your brother. Edmund had been silent through this entire exchange, watching his younger brother with growing horror. Victor, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't use me. Victor looked at Edmund with something like pity. You made yourself useful, brother. That's all anyone is in the end. Useful or expendable. You were useful for taking the blame, for being the obvious monster everyone could focus on while I quietly accumulated real power. And Evelyn? Edmund's voice cracked. The terrorizing, the cellar room, the threats? All yours, Victor confirmed. I never touched her directly. Didn't need to. You were so enthusiastic about controlling her, I just let you continue. Every bruise you gave her was another piece of evidence against you and another reason she'd never suspect me of being involved. Edmund lunged at his brother with a roar of rage and betrayal. Marcus and the security personnel intercepted him, holding him back while Edmund screamed obscenities. And Victor stood there with cold calculation replacing the mask of concern. Webb watched it all, with the detached interest of someone who'd seen family betrayals before. Mr. Ashford, he said to Victor, you're under arrest pending investigation. Take him. The junior officials moved to restrain Victor, who didn't resist. As they led him toward the door, he looked back at Adrian with something almost like respect. You had no documentation, Victor said. That was a bluff. Yes, Adrian agreed, but you confirmed everything by reacting to it. Amateur mistake. You haven't won, Your Grace. The case against you still stands. Those forged documents exist. The Crown investigation continues. Probably true, Adrian said. But now they'll be investigating why the documents were forged and who had both motive and access to create them. And that trail leads directly back to you. Victor smiled, a cold expression. Even if I fall, you're compromised. The scandal alone will destroy your reputation. The Iron Duke brought down by family conspiracy. You'll spend years clearing your name if you ever manage it at all. Then I'll spend years. Adrian's voice remained level. But you'll spend them in prison, and Evelyn will be free of both you and your brother. That's acceptable to me. They led Victor away. Edmund had stopped struggling, now just standing between security personnel looking devastated and broken. Webb approached Adrian with a complex expression. Your Grace, this doesn't clear you entirely. We still need to investigate those forged documents, verify your claims, conduct forensic analysis of signatures and contracts. It will take time. I understand, Adrian said. I'll cooperate fully. But Webb continued, given the revelations about Victor Ashford's manipulation of evidence, we're suspending the immediate arrest procedures. You'll remain free pending investigation, though your assets stay frozen and you're restricted from leaving the jurisdiction. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even close to victory. But it was survival, which was more than Adrian had expected 10 minutes ago. Webb turned to Edmund. Lord Ashford, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and abuse. Take him. Edmund didn't resist as they led him away. He looked at Evelyn one last time, his expression unreadable. She stared back without flinching, and Adrian saw something shift in her posture. The perpetual tension that had marked her since their wedding night eased slightly, not gone but diminished. The room emptied slowly. Government officials, security personnel, arrested conspirators, until finally it was just Adrian and Evelyn standing in the receiving room surrounded by scattered documents that represented the wreckage of multiple conspiracies colliding. Marcus returned with a sheepish expression. Your Grace, there was nothing in that hidden safe compartment. I know, Adrian said, because there is no hidden safe compartment. It was a bluff. Effective bluff. Marcus allowed himself a slight smile before withdrawing to give them privacy. Evelyn walked to the table and picked up one of the forged documents bearing Adrian's signature. They're good forgeries. I can barely tell the difference. Victor's thorough, if nothing else, Adrian said. He moved to pour himself a drink, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. Whiskey at 10 in the morning wasn't ideal, but the circumstances seemed to warrant it. What happens now? Evelyn asked. Now we wait. The investigation continues. Webb will eventually determine the documents are forged, but that takes time. Weeks, maybe months. Meanwhile, my reputation is shredded, my assets are frozen, and I'm effectively under house arrest. Because you tried to help me. Adrian drank half the whiskey in one swallow. Because I underestimated the opposition. Victor was smarter than I gave him credit for. He used my own reputation against me. The Iron Duke, cold and calculating, obviously capable of criminal conspiracy. It was logical enough that the government believed it. I'm sorry, Evelyn whispered. This is my fault. No. Adrian set down the glass. This is Victor's fault and Edmund's fault and my fault for not investigating thoroughly enough before agreeing to the marriage. But not yours. You were a victim trying to survive. Everything that followed was other people's choices. She looked at him with tears sliding down her face. You lost everything trying to save me, and you didn't even like me when this started. I didn't know you when this started, Adrian corrected. There's a difference. And I didn't lose everything. My reputation will recover eventually. My assets will be unfrozen when the investigation concludes. I'll survive. But you'll never be the same. The Iron Duke everyone feared. That's gone now. Adrian considered this. Maybe that's not entirely bad. Being untouchable meant being isolated. Maybe being human, being vulnerable, being known as someone who chose principle over profit at least once, that might be valuable in ways I haven't experienced. It was the closest thing to philosophical reflection Adrian had allowed himself in years. And it felt strange but not entirely unwelcome. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Marcus appeared again, this time with Thomas Whitmore. The clerk looked even more miserable than before. He insists on speaking with you, Marcus said. Claims he has information about Mary's imprisonment that you need to hear. Adrian waved Whitmore forward. Speak. Mary wasn't just held at that hunting lodge, Whitmore said in a rush. Victor visited her repeatedly. Talked to her about Lady Evelyn, about you, about the family dynamics. He was using her as an information source. Every detail she knew about Edmund's abuse, about Evelyn's inheritance, about the household servants who'd been dismissed. Victor gathered all of it and used it to build his case. So Mary wasn't protected, she was interrogated. Gently, but yes. And Your Grace, there's more. Victor kept records of those conversations. Detailed notes about everything Mary told him. If we can find those records, they'll prove that Victor knew about Edmund's crimes years ago and did nothing. That he actively enabled the abuse because it served his purposes. Adrian's mind engaged again, shifting from survival mode to strategic planning. Where would Victor keep such records? His private office in the Treasury building. He has a locked cabinet there. Mary mentioned it during one of the interrogations. If those records exist and we can access them, they'd destroy Victor's credibility completely. He positioned himself as the innocent family member shocked by Edmund's crimes. But if he knew all along and deliberately allowed it to continue, that's criminal negligence at minimum, conspiracy at maximum. Evelyn stepped forward. How do we get into Victor's office? We don't, Adrian said. We can't. I'm under restriction. Breaking into a government building would be actual treason. But I'm not under restriction, Evelyn said. And technically, as Victor's cousin, I might have legitimate reason to access his personal effects, especially if I claim I'm looking for family documents related to my inheritance. Adrian looked at her carefully. That's dangerous. If you're caught, you could be arrested alongside Edmund and Victor. I spent 5 years being terrified, Evelyn said. I'm done being afraid. If there's evidence that can prove Victor's guilt and clear your name, I want to get it. It would require breaking and entering, potentially theft of government property. I've lived my entire adult life as stolen property, Your Grace. I think I can manage stealing some documents. Adrian almost smiled. Almost. Then we need a plan. Marcus, I need a building layout of the Treasury offices and a schedule of guard rotations. Evelyn, you'll need documentation supporting your claim to access Victor's personal effects, and we'll need to move fast before Victor's allies realize what we're attempting. It was insane. Reckless. Exactly the kind of desperate gamble that could destroy everything if it failed. But Adrian was already destroyed. His reputation was ruined, his assets frozen, his carefully constructed empire of control shattered, which meant, perversely, that he finally had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose were the most dangerous opponents of all. He looked at Evelyn, seeing her properly for perhaps the first time since their wedding night. Not as a contractual obligation or a strategic asset or even as a victim to be saved, but as a partner. Someone who'd walked into his devastation and chosen to stay, chosen to fight, chosen to risk everything because she understood that some wars were worth fighting even when victory wasn't guaranteed. Tomorrow night, Adrian said, we raid Victor's office, find those records, and prove that he's been orchestrating this entire nightmare from the beginning. If we succeed, we clear both our names and ensure Edmund and Victor spend decades in prison. If we fail, we're arrested as co-conspirators and lose everything. Evelyn met his eyes steadily. Then we better not fail. Adrian nodded. Then we better not fail. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the morning clouds, casting golden light across Blackthorn Manor's gardens. It should have looked hopeful. Instead, it just illuminated all the cracks in the facade, all the ways everything Adrian had built was coming apart. But in the ruins, something else was being constructed. Not empire or reputation or untouchable power. Something smaller and infinitely more fragile. Partnership. Real partnership, forged in the fire of mutual destruction. And if that was all Adrian had left after the Iron Duke's fall, maybe it would be enough. 24 hours to plan a break-in that could either save them or destroy what little remained. Adrian spent those hours the way he'd spent countless negotiations, methodically, ruthlessly, accepting that perfection was impossible and survival was the only metric that mattered. Marcus returned with blueprints of the Treasury building acquired through contacts Adrian preferred not to examine too closely. The layout was exactly what Adrian expected from government architecture, designed for security, monitored entrances, guard rotations every 4 hours, and Victor's office on the 3rd floor with a single window facing an interior courtyard. That window was their entry point. Everything else was locked down tight. Evelyn studied the blueprints with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned to memorize escape routes by necessity. Her finger traced the path from courtyard to office to exit. 3 minutes to climb. 5 minutes to search Victor's locked cabinet. 2 minutes to photograph documents. 3 minutes to evacuate. 13 minutes total if nothing went wrong. Everything always goes wrong, Adrian said flatly. Plan for 20 minutes minimum. Then we need a distraction. Something that pulls guards away from the interior courtyard long enough for us to climb unseen. Fire, Marcus suggested. Small, controlled, in the East Wing storage rooms. Nothing that endangers lives, but enough smoke to trigger evacuations and pull security resources. Adrian nodded. Time it for 11 at night. Guard rotation happens at 10:30. New shift will still be settling in, less alert. Fire starts at 11. We enter at 11:05 during the chaos. And if we're caught? Evelyn's voice remained steady, but her hands betrayed tension, fingers curling and uncurling against the table edge. If we're caught, I claim full responsibility. Say I coerced you, threatened you, manipulated you into helping. Your uncle's documented abuse gives you plausible deniability. You were traumatized, vulnerable, under the influence of a powerful man. It's not true, but it's believable. I won't let you take the blame alone. You will if I order it." Adrian met her eyes with the cold authority that had governed his entire adult life. "This isn't nobility, Evelyn. It's strategy. One of us in prison is survivable. Both of us is permanent defeat. If it comes down to it, you run, and I cover your escape." She wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the flash of defiance in her eyes. But she also understood the mathematics. Adrian was already compromised by Victor's conspiracy. One more crime wouldn't substantially worsen his position, but Evelyn was still technically a victim. Getting caught would transform her from sympathetic figure to criminal co-conspirator. "Fine," she said, "but if you survive and I don't, you better make sure Victor and Edmund rot in prison forever." That was always the plan. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Adrian wrote letters to his solicitor, his business partners, his few remaining allies, explaining the situation and providing instructions in case of his arrest or worse. Evelyn gathered the documents she'd need to justify accessing Victor's office if questioned. Marcus coordinated with the two security personnel he trusted absolutely. Men who'd worked for the Blackthorne family long enough to understand loyalty meant sometimes breaking laws to serve justice. As sunset approached, Adrian found himself standing in his study again, staring at the portrait of his father that dominated one wall. The old Duke looked stern and disapproving, exactly as he'd looked in life. A man who'd built power through calculated marriages and ruthless business dealings and expected his son to maintain that empire through identical methods. Adrian had tried, spent 32 years being exactly what his father wanted: cold, efficient, untouchable. And it had worked right up until the moment he decided one woman's suffering mattered more than strategic advantage. Now the empire was collapsing, and Adrian was planning to commit actual crimes to save someone he'd known for less than a week. His father would have been horrified, or perhaps impressed by the audacity. Hard to say with the old bastard. "Your Grace," Evelyn's voice from the doorway. "It's time." Adrian turned from the portrait. She'd changed into dark practical clothes, her hair tied back, face set with determination that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. She looked like someone preparing for battle, which was accurate enough. "Ready?" he asked. "No, but we're doing it anyway. That's usually how courage works." They left through the servants' entrance, Marcus and his two men following at a discreet distance. The carriage waiting outside bore no Blackthorne crests, nothing identifiable. Just a plain vehicle that could belong to anyone. Adrian had learned years ago that invisibility was often more valuable than intimidation. The drive to the Treasury District took 40 minutes through London's evening traffic. Adrian spent it reviewing the plan silently, calculating contingencies, accepting that no amount of preparation would eliminate the fundamental insanity of what they were attempting. Breaking into a government building to steal evidence that might or might not exist, based on the testimony of a clerk who'd already proven himself compromised. But doing nothing meant accepting Victor's victory, meant letting Edmund and Victor walk away while Adrian's reputation remained destroyed and Evelyn remained legally bound to a family that had tortured her. So they'd gamble everything on one desperate play. The carriage stopped 3 blocks from the Treasury building. They continued on foot, moving through shadows, avoiding main streets. Marcus had timed it perfectly. At exactly 11 o'clock, smoke began pouring from the East Wing's ground floor windows. Not enough to see flames, just thick gray smoke that triggered immediate response. Guards rushed toward the source. Bells rang, people shouted, the controlled chaos of emergency procedures activating. "Now," Adrian said. They ran across the open courtyard while attention focused elsewhere, reaching the base of the building's west wall. The window to Victor's office glowed faintly 3 floors up. Marcus produced rope and a grappling hook, the kind of equipment Adrian never thought he'd see his head of security deploy. Marcus threw. The hook caught on the first try, catching the window's stone frame with a soft metallic sound that made Adrian's heart spike. But the chaos of the fire response covered it. No one turned. No one noticed 3 figures beginning to climb. Adrian went first, his hands remembering skills from childhood when he'd climbed trees on the family estate. Hand over hand, boots finding purchase on decorative stonework, breathing controlled despite the adrenaline. He reached the window and tested it carefully, locked, as expected. He pulled out the thin metal tools Marcus had provided and worked the lock with hands steadier than they should have been. This was insane. He was the Duke of Blackthorn, reduced to breaking and entering like a common thief. The absurdity almost made him laugh. The lock clicked open. Adrian pushed the window up slowly, listening for alarms or detection. Nothing. He climbed through into Victor's private office, then reached back to help Evelyn up. She came through the window with practiced grace, landing silently beside him. Marcus followed, then closed the window behind them, leaving it slightly ajar for quick escape. 5 minutes, Adrian whispered. Find that cabinet. Victor's office was exactly what Adrian expected. Immaculately organized, expensive furniture, walls lined with legal texts and financial regulations. The locked cabinet Marcus had mentioned stood against the far wall, substantial and ominous. Adrian crossed to it and examined the lock, more sophisticated than the window. This would take time they might not have. He pulled out the tools again and began working, his hands moving by feel more than sight in the dim light filtering through the window. Eveline kept watch at the door while Marcus searched the desk, looking for anything else useful. The sounds of the fire response continued outside, muffled but ongoing. They had maybe 10 more minutes before the smoke was dealt with and security returned to normal patterns. The cabinet lock was stubborn. Adrian's hands cramped. Sweat slid down his spine. He forced himself to breathe steadily, to not rush, to treat this like any other negotiation where patience determined victory. The lock clicked. The cabinet door swung open. Inside were rows of files, each meticulously labeled. Adrian scanned them quickly, looking for anything related to Edmund, Evelyn, or the conspiracy. And there, in the back, a file marked simply, Family Matters in Victor's precise handwriting. Adrian pulled it out and opened it. Inside were pages of notes documenting conversations with Mary, detailing everything she'd told Victor about Edmund's abuse of Evelyn. Dates, specific incidents, descriptions of bruises and threats, and the cellar room Edmund had shown Evelyn the night before the wedding. Victor had known everything for years, and documented it all with clinical precision while doing absolutely nothing to help. There was more. Correspondence between Victor and junior government officials discussing how best to build a case against Adrian. Drafts of the forged contracts. Plans for timing the arrest to maximize damage to both Edmund and Adrian simultaneously. It was comprehensive evidence of Victor's manipulation and criminal negligence. Exactly what they needed. Adrian pulled out the small camera Marcus had provided and began photographing pages as fast as he could. The flash seemed impossibly bright in the dark office, each burst of light a beacon announcing their presence. "Hurry," Evelyn whispered from the door. "I hear footsteps." Adrian photographed faster, hands moving mechanically through the stack. 10 pages. 20. 30. The footsteps grew louder. Someone was coming down the corridor outside, boots striking stone in steady rhythm. "Almost done," Adrian muttered. "Another 10 pages? 5. 3. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Adrian froze, camera in hand, every muscle locked. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall beside the door, barely breathing. Marcus had his hand on his weapon, ready to fight if necessary. The door handle began to turn. In that moment, Adrian understood with perfect clarity that they were about to be caught. All the planning, all the careful preparation, undone by simple bad luck. Someone had returned to Victor's office during the fire response, and they were about to discover 3 intruders committing blatant crimes. Everything Adrian had tried to protect was about to collapse completely. The door opened. A guard stepped through, lantern raised. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The Duke of Blackthorn standing at an open cabinet with a camera, Lady Evelyn pressed against the wall. Marcus positioned like a coiled weapon. For one frozen second, no one moved. Then training took over. The guard reached for his whistle to sound alarm. Marcus lunged, hand covering the guard's mouth before sound could emerge. They struggled silently, brutal and efficient, 2 men fighting for control. Adrian shoved the file back in the cabinet and slammed it shut, grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We go now." But Marcus was still grappling with the guard, both men locked in combat that was rapidly escalating. The guard's hand found his club, swung it hard. Marcus blocked, but the impact sent him stumbling backward. The guard got the whistle to his lips, blew one sharp blast before Marcus recovered and struck him hard enough to drop him to the floor, unconscious but breathing. That single whistle blast echoed through the building like a gunshot. Run, Marcus said. I'll hold them. No. Adrian moved to help Marcus. We go together or not at all. Your Grace, there's no time. Marcus was already moving toward the door. That whistle brings every guard in the building. You have the evidence. Get it to Harrison Webb. Make it count. Marcus, that's an order. Orders don't mean shit if you're in prison and Victor walks free. Marcus actually smiled. I've served your family 30 years, Your Grace. Let me do it right. Then he was gone, running into the corridor, shouting to draw attention away from the office. Adrian heard boots pounding, multiple guards responding, Marcus's voice leading them away from where Adrian and Evelyn stood frozen. We can't leave him, Evelyn said. We have to. Adrian grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the window. He made his choice. We honor it by surviving. They climbed out the window as shouts echoed through the building. The rope still hung in place. Adrian wrapped it around Evelyn first, lowering her as fast as he dared, arms burning with the strain. She reached the ground and stepped clear. Adrian followed, sliding down the rope fast enough that it burned his palms through his gloves. He hit the courtyard at a run, Evelyn beside him, both of them sprinting toward the shadows, while behind them the Treasury building erupted with activity. Guards poured into the courtyard. Lanterns blazed. Someone shouted orders. Adrian and Evelyn kept running, legs burning, lungs screaming, the camera with its precious evidence banging against Adrian's chest. They made it to the outer wall. Over it in a scrambling climb that scraped skin and tore clothes. Down the other side into an alley where the waiting carriage should have been. Empty. The carriage was gone. Of course it was. Marcus had arranged for it to leave if they didn't return within 30 minutes, ensuring no evidence connected the break-in to Blackthorn Manor. Smart strategy. Terrible timing. Adrian grabbed Evelyn's hand again, and they ran through London's night streets like criminals fleeing justice, which was exactly what they were. Behind them, whistles shrilled and boots pounded stone. The hunt had begun. They ducked into a narrow alley between warehouses, pressed themselves into shadows while guards rushed past the entrance. Adrian's heart hammered so hard he thought it might rupture. Evelyn shook beside him, whether from cold or fear or sheer adrenaline crash, he couldn't tell. They caught Marcus, she whispered. We left him. He chose it. Adrian's voice came out harder than intended. He understood the math. 1 arrest to save 2. That's how you win when losing is guaranteed. Is that what we're doing? Winning. Adrian looked at the camera in his hands, at the evidence that might or might not be enough to destroy Victor and save them both. We're surviving. Same thing at this point. They waited in that alley for an hour while the search expanded through surrounding streets. Eventually, the immediate pursuit moved on, guards spreading wider, assuming the fugitives had gotten farther than they actually had. We need to move, Adrian said. Get this evidence to Webb before Victor learns we broke into his office. How? We have no carriage, no safe route, and by now there's probably wanted notices with our descriptions posted at every checkpoint. Then we walk. Stay to back streets, avoid main roads, trust that London's big enough to hide 2 desperate people for a few hours. They emerged from the alley and began moving through the darkness. 2 aristocrats in dark clothes, one of them carrying a camera that contained proof of conspiracy. It would have been absurd if it wasn't terrifying. Adrian's mind raced through options as they walked. Webb lived in the government district, too risky to approach directly. But Webb had an office at the magistrate's court on the South Bank. If they could reach it, leave the evidence where Webb would find it in the morning, that might work. South Bank meant crossing the river. Thames bridges would be watched, guarded, impossible to cross undetected, unless they didn't use a bridge. Adrian changed direction, pulling Evelyn toward the docks. She followed without question, trusting him to have a plan even when that trust might be misplaced. The docks at night were a different world from aristocratic London. Rough men loading cargo, prostitutes negotiating prices, thieves looking for opportunities. Adrian pulled his coat tighter and kept his head down, adopting the posture of someone who belonged here, who had business and shouldn't be questioned. A small boat, he said to a dock worker smoking a pipe. Something fast enough to cross the river. I'll pay double rate. The man looked at them with knowing eyes. Running from something, are you? Does it matter? Depends what you're running from. Guards mean trouble for anyone who helps you. Adrian pulled out a gold sovereign, more money than the man probably earned in a month. This says it doesn't matter. The man pocketed the coin and jerked his head toward a small rowboat tied to the dock. That'll get you across. Leave it on the south bank, someone will find it. They climbed into the boat. Adrian took the oars, his hands already raw from the rope climb. Eveline sat opposite, watching him row with steady determination through dark water that stank of waste and industrial runoff. Halfway across, she spoke quietly. If we survive this, if the evidence works and Victor goes to prison and we clear our names, what happens then? Adrian pulled the oars, muscles burning. Then you get your inheritance back, full legal control, no guardian, no husband controlling your assets unless you choose otherwise. And you? I rebuild whatever's left of my reputation. Probably takes years, possibly never works completely. The Iron Duke fell, after all. Hard to climb back to untouchable when everyone's seen you desperate. Is that what bothers you? That people saw you desperate? Adrian pulled the oars harder. What bothers me is that I spent 32 years building something I thought was indestructible, and 1 week with you proved how fragile it all was. Power, reputation, control, all of it balanced on the assumption that I'd never care about anything enough to risk it. And now you do. Care, I mean. It was a statement, not a question, and Adrian didn't answer because answering would require acknowledging feelings he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Easier to focus on the immediate problem. Survival first. Feelings later. Maybe never. They reached the south bank. Adrian tied the boat and they scrambled onto the dock, both of them soaked and shivering. The magistrate's court stood 6 blocks inland. They walked through streets empty except for drunks and night workers who had their own problems and ignored 2 wet aristocrats moving with purpose. The court building was dark and locked. Adrian circled it looking for entry points while Eveline kept watch. A ground floor window had a broken latch, amateur security for a government building, but Adrian wasn't complaining. They climbed through into a records room. Adrian found Webb's office on the 2nd floor and picked that lock too, his hands moving automatically now, muscle memory replacing conscious thought. Webb's desk was covered with case files. Adrian cleared space and laid out the camera. Then he wrote a quick note on official court stationery explaining what the camera contained, where it came from, and why Webb needed to develop the photographs immediately. He signed it simply. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke. No hiding now. No deniability. This was full confession of breaking and entering, theft of evidence, criminal conspiracy. If Webb didn't believe the photographs or decided Adrian's methods disqualified the evidence, everything was lost. But if Webb looked at those images and saw what Adrian saw, Victor's perfect conspiracy would collapse. They left through the same window they'd entered. Dawn was maybe 2 hours away, London's sky beginning to lighten from black to dark blue. By morning, the city would know the Duke of Blackthorne had committed crimes in broad defiance of Crown restrictions. By morning, everything would be decided. "Where do we go?" Eveline asked as they stood in the street outside the magistrate's court. "Blackthorne Manor." Adrian started walking, exhaustion beginning to replace adrenaline. "We go home and wait for whatever comes next. They'll arrest us. Probably, but at least they'll arrest us somewhere comfortable." They walked through the pre-dawn streets of London like ghosts, 2 people who'd gambled everything and had no idea if they'd won or lost. Behind them, evidence sat on Harrison Webb's desk. Ahead of them, consequences waited in whatever form the law decided to deliver. Adrian's hands throbbed where rope had burned them. His clothes were soaked and filthy. His reputation was in tatters. His oldest servant was arrested. His assets were frozen. Everything he'd built over 3 decades was either destroyed or teetering on the edge. And walking beside him was a woman he'd married for strategic advantage, whose uncle had tried to destroy them both, whose cousin had orchestrated a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded. Against all logic, against every principle he'd ever held, Adrian reached out and took her hand. She gripped back, her fingers cold and trembling but steady. They walked home together as the sun began to rise over London, 2 criminals waiting to discover if their crime had been justice or just another disaster in a week of catastrophes. Blackthorne Manor appeared through the morning mist like a fortress under siege, which Adrian supposed it was. His empire reduced to 1 building and the hope that evidence delivered to a government official would somehow fix everything. They entered through the front door this time. No more sneaking. No more pretense. Marcus was arrested. They'd committed crimes. Either Webb would see the truth or nothing mattered anyway. Inside, the manor staff waited in the entrance hall. Every servant, every member of the household, standing at attention like an honor guard. Your Grace, the head butler said formally, we received word that Mr. Marcus was arrested during your operation. We wanted you to know that every person in this household stands ready to testify on your behalf, should it come to that. Adrian looked at their faces. Servants he'd employed for years, people he'd barely noticed because noticing staff meant acknowledging their humanity instead of their function. Now they stood united, offering loyalty he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Thank you, he managed. That means more than you know. The staff dispersed to morning duties, leaving Adrian and Evelyn alone in the entrance hall as gray light filtered through high windows. Now we wait, Evelyn said. Now we wait. They went to the study. Adrian poured them both drinks despite the early hour because pretending it was too early for whiskey seemed absurd given everything else. They sat in chairs facing the window, watching London wake up, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. An hour passed. Then 2. Adrian dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. When he woke, full morning sun blazed through the windows and someone was pounding on the manor's front door. Adrian stood, his body protesting every movement. Evelyn was already awake, watching the door with the expression of someone waiting for execution. Shall I answer it? The butler asked from the doorway. Yes, Adrian said. Whatever's coming, we face it. The pounding continued. Authoritative, aggressive, the kind of knocking that didn't ask permission. Adrian heard the front door open, heard voices, heard boots on marble floors. Harrison Webb appeared in the study doorway, flanked by 4 constables. The senior investigator held a folder that Adrian recognized as the case file against him and Edmund. Your Grace, Webb said formally. Lady Evelyn, I need you both to come with me. Are we under arrest? Adrian asked. Webb's expression was unreadable. That depends on how honest you're willing to be about what you did last night. Adrian met his eyes steadily. We broke into Victor Ashford's office at the Treasury building. We photographed evidence proving Victor has been orchestrating a conspiracy to frame both Edmund and myself while covering up years of criminal negligence regarding the abuse of Lady Evelyn. We left that evidence on your desk because going through official channels would have taken months we don't have. So yes, we committed crimes. And no, I don't regret it. Webb was silent for a long moment. Then he opened the folder and pulled out photographs. The same images Adrian had taken last night, now developed and crystal clear. Pages of Victor's handwritten notes documenting everything Mary had told him about Edmund's abuse, the forged contracts, the correspondence with government officials. All of it undeniable. These photographs, Webb said slowly, represent evidence obtained through illegal means. Under normal circumstances, I'd be forced to exclude them from any legal proceedings. Adrian's chest tightened. Then we're finished. I said under normal circumstances, Webb continued, but there's a provision in Crown law for evidence obtained through emergency necessity. If waiting for official warrants would have resulted in immediate destruction of evidence or harm to individuals, illegally obtained material can be admitted. And you think this qualifies? Evelyn asked. Webb looked at her directly. Lady Evelyn, these notes document systematic abuse that Victor Ashford witnessed and ignored for years. They prove he deliberately enabled criminal activity while simultaneously framing others. If we'd waited for proper warrants, Victor would have had time to destroy everything. So yes, I believe this qualifies as emergency necessity. Adrian felt something that might have been hope trying to surface through exhaustion. What happens now? Now I arrest Victor Ashford for conspiracy, criminal negligence, obstruction of justice, and about 6 other charges. I release your assets from Crown supervision. I formally apologize for the investigation into your involvement with Edmund's crimes, which these photographs prove was manufactured by Victor, and I pretend I don't know exactly how these photographs came into my possession. You're letting us go? I'm acknowledging that sometimes justice requires bending rules designed by people who've never faced real consequences. Webb closed the folder. Edmund Ashford is already in custody. Victor will join him within the hour. Between them, they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. Marcus will be released with apologies and compensation for wrongful arrest. You and Lady Evelyn will be cleared of all suspicion. Adrian sat down heavily. It was over. Actually over. Victor's perfect conspiracy had been destroyed by the evidence he'd arrogantly kept instead of destroying. There will still be scandal, Webb continued. People will know you married into a criminal family. Questions will be raised about judgment, about associations. Your reputation won't return to what it was overnight. I don't care about my reputation anymore, Adrian said quietly. I care that Edmund and Victor face justice and Evelyn gets her life back. Webb nodded. Then we're finished here. Unless you have anything else to confess, nothing that wouldn't complicate your life unnecessarily, then good day, Your Grace. Lady Evelyn, try to stay out of government buildings without permission in the future. Webb left with his constables, taking the evidence and leaving behind silence that felt heavier than anything Adrian had experienced. Evelyn stood and crossed to where Adrian sat. She knelt beside his chair and took his burned, exhausted hands in hers. You did it, she said. You actually did it. We did it, Adrian corrected. I couldn't have gotten into that office without you. Wouldn't have had reason to try without you. Still, the Iron Duke brought down 2 conspiracies and destroyed his own reputation in the process. That's going to make an interesting historical footnote. The Iron Duke is dead, Adrian said. Whatever I am now, it's something different. What are you now? He looked at her properly. This woman who'd been a stranger 10 days ago and was now the only person in the world who'd seen him at his absolute worst and chosen to stay anyway. Honestly, I have no idea, but I think I'd like to find out. Evelyn smiled, the first genuine smile he'd ever seen from her. Then let's find out together. Outside, London continued its morning routines, indifferent to the empire that had fallen and the 2 people beginning to build something new from its ruins. But inside Blackthorn Manor, for the first time in either of their lives, Adrian and Evelyn allowed themselves to imagine that maybe survival wasn't the best they could hope for. Maybe there was something beyond survival, something that looked like healing, like partnership, like the beginning of becoming people neither of them had been brave enough to try being before. It would take time. Years, probably. Reputations didn't rebuild quickly, and trauma didn't disappear just because the abusers were finally imprisoned. But time was something they finally had. Time. And each other. And the knowledge that when everything else collapsed, they'd fought side by side instead of turning on each other. Adrian pulled Evelyn to her feet, and then, because the rules he'd lived by his entire life no longer applied, he kissed her. It wasn't graceful or practiced. It was desperate and exhausted and tasted like fear and whiskey and the sharp edge of relief. But it was real, maybe the first real thing Adrian had allowed himself in decades. When they broke apart, Evelyn laughed quietly. So that's what the Duke kisses like when he's not performing. Terrible, probably. I'm out of practice at anything genuine. No, she said. It was perfect. Because it was honest. And somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the hour, marking the moment when 2 people who'd been destroyed by conspiracy and rebuilt through desperate gambles finally allowed themselves to believe that maybe, impossibly, they'd found something worth surviving for after all. 3 weeks after Victor's arrest, Adrian stood in the Crown Court's public gallery watching 2 men who'd once commanded empires reduced to defendants in cheap prison clothes. Edmund Ashford looked hollowed out, his arrogance stripped away by weeks in custody and the dawning realization that no amount of money or intimidation would save him now. Victor maintained his composure better, but Adrian could see cracks forming. The younger Ashford brother kept glancing at the exit like he still believed escape was possible if he could just calculate the right angle. There was no angle. Webb had built the case with surgical precision, using Victor's own meticulous documentation against him. Every note about Mary's interrogation, every forged contract, every piece of correspondence with corrupt officials, all of it presented to a jury that looked increasingly horrified as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Evelyn sat beside Adrian, her posture rigid with the kind of tension that came from finally confronting monsters who'd lived in her nightmares for years. She'd testified 3 days earlier, describing Edmund's abuse with a steady voice that occasionally cracked, but never broke. The jury had looked at her bruises, photographed and documented, and something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. This wasn't just financial crime anymore. This was systematic torture of a vulnerable woman by the men legally responsible for protecting her. The prosecution had been smart. They'd led with the abuse, established Edmund as a monster, then revealed Victor's complicity in enabling and covering it up. By the time they got to the financial crimes and the conspiracy against Adrian, the jury was already primed to believe the worst. Now the defense attorneys were making their closing arguments, grasping at technicalities and reasonable doubt that rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Adrian watched with the detached interest of someone who'd already won but needed to see the victory formalized. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdicts in a voice that echoed through the silent courtroom. Edmund Ashford, guilty on all counts. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, abuse, and 8 other charges that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. Victor Ashford, guilty on all counts. Criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, criminal negligence, forging official documents, and 6 additional charges that ensured he'd die in prison alongside his brother. The judge pronounced sentencing with cold efficiency. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole for Edmund. 40 years for Victor, which at his age amounted to the same thing. It was over. Actually, finally over. Adrian felt Eveline's hand find his, gripping tight enough to hurt. He looked at her and saw tears sliding down her face, but her expression wasn't grief. It was relief so profound it looked like pain. The weight she'd carried for 5 years, the terror that her abusers would escape justice, finally lifting. They left the courthouse through a side exit, avoiding the crowd of journalists and curious onlookers gathered at the main entrance. Adrian's carriage waited in a narrow street, Marcus standing beside it, looking only slightly worse for his brief imprisonment. The head of security had been released with official apologies and a compensation payment he'd donated entirely to a charity supporting abuse survivors. "Your Grace," Marcus said formally. "Lady Eveline." "Marcus," Adrian replied. "Thank you for what you did." "In Victor's office. Just doing my job, sir. Your job doesn't include getting arrested to protect me." Marcus smiled slightly. "My job is whatever keeps this family intact. That's what I did." They rode back to Blackthorn Manor in silence. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of legal proceedings, damage control, and slowly beginning to rebuild both their reputations and their lives. The scandal had been enormous, exactly as Adrian had predicted. Every newspaper in London had covered the Ashford conspiracy, and Adrian's role in bringing it down had been dissected from every possible angle. Some praised him as a hero who'd risked everything for justice. Others condemned him for breaking laws, even in service of a good cause. Most seemed confused about how to categorize a duke who'd committed crimes to expose greater crimes, who destroyed his own reputation to save someone else. Adrian didn't care anymore what they thought. That was the strangest part of surviving catastrophe, discovering that the opinions of strangers who'd never risked anything mattered far less than he'd always believed. Power built on reputation was fragile. Power built on knowing who you actually were turned out to be more durable. The manor felt different when they arrived. Less like a fortress, more like a home. Adrian had spent the past weeks making changes. Lighter curtains in the main rooms, more windows open to let in air and sound. Small adjustments that transformed the atmosphere from intimidating to merely impressive. Eveline had her own suite now, separate from Adrian's chambers, decorated according to her preferences rather than his mother's ghost. She spent hours there planning what she'd do with her restored inheritance. Schools for girls from abusive homes, shelters with actual security instead of just locked doors. Legal funds for women trapped in situations like hers had been. Adrian supported it all, both financially and practically. Turned out having a wife who actually cared about using wealth for something beyond accumulation was contagious. He'd started reviewing his own business practices, looking for places where efficiency had crossed into exploitation, where profit had trumped basic human decency. It was uncomfortable work, acknowledging that the empire he'd built had hurt people even as it enriched him. But discomfort felt appropriate. Growth without pain was just rearranging the same furniture. That evening, they had dinner in the smaller dining room instead of the formal hall. Just the two of them, no servants hovering, no performance required. Eveline had insisted on it weeks ago, claiming she'd spent enough of her life performing for audiences who didn't care about her actual humanity. Adrian had agreed because refusing would have been admitting he was still more comfortable with performance than authenticity. And he was trying, in his awkward, methodical way, to become someone capable of genuine connection instead of just strategic alliance. "They're really going to prison," Eveline said quietly, pushing food around her plate without eating much. "For the rest of their lives." "It still doesn't feel real." "It will," Adrian replied. "Eventually, the nightmares will fade, the hypervigilance will ease. You'll wake up one morning and realize you haven't thought about them in hours instead of minutes. How do you know? Because I've spent 3 weeks watching you start to believe you're actually safe. The way you walk through rooms without checking exits first. The way you sleep without waking every hour. Small changes, but significant. Evelyn set down her fork. I keep waiting for it to be taken away. For someone to announce there was a legal technicality and they're being released. For Edmund to appear in a doorway with that smile he used right before something terrible happened. He won't. Adrian's voice carried absolute certainty. Webb made sure of that. The convictions are airtight. Every appeal will fail. Edmund and Victor will die in prison cells, and you'll die old and free with a legacy that actually matters. And you? What will you die as? It was the question Adrian had been avoiding for weeks. What remained of the Iron Duke after the ice melted? Who was he without the armor of untouchability, without the reputation for cold calculation, without the empire of control he'd spent decades building? I don't know yet, he admitted. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not performing invincibility. That's terrifying, isn't it? Not knowing, completely. But also liberating. Turns out you can survive being seen as weak and flawed. People don't actually destroy you for being human. Some of them even like you better for it. Evelyn smiled, and Adrian saw traces of the woman she might have become if Edmund had never stolen her childhood. Lighter, sharper, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with survival instincts and everything to do with choosing to fight for things that mattered. I like you better for it, she said. The real you is far more interesting than the performance. The real me is a disaster who doesn't know how to have conversations without calculating strategic advantage. Then it's a good thing I spent 5 years learning to communicate with disasters. We'll figure it out together. They finished dinner and moved to the study, a ritual they'd developed over the past weeks. Adrian would review business correspondence while Evelyn planned her charity projects, both of them working in comfortable silence that required no performance or pretense. But tonight felt different, heavier somehow, like the weight of everything they'd survived was finally catching up now that the immediate crisis had passed. Adrian found himself watching Evelyn instead of reading his correspondence, studying the way lamplight caught in her dark hair, the fierce concentration on her face as she wrote, the small unconscious habits she'd developed in the safety of his home. When had she stopped being a contractual obligation and become the most important person in his life? He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was that first night in the destroyed bridal chamber. Maybe it was during the raid on Victor's office. Maybe it was the cumulative weight of choosing her survival over his reputation so many times that the pattern became identity. Evelyn looked up and caught him staring. What? I was thinking about the wedding night, Adrian said. How I stood outside your door and noticed blood on the doorframe and thought something was catastrophically wrong. You weren't incorrect. No. But I had no idea how wrong, how deep the conspiracy went, how much courage it would take from both of us to survive it. Do you regret it? Marrying me, I mean. Knowing what it cost you. Adrian considered this question seriously. His reputation was damaged, probably permanently. His business empire had been disrupted by weeks of legal proceedings and frozen assets. Several lucrative contracts had been canceled by partners who couldn't afford association with scandal. The neat, controlled life he'd built had been shattered into pieces that would never fit back together the same way. No, he said finally. I regret that you suffered. I regret that Edmund and Victor had years to damage you before I could intervene, but marrying you, fighting for you, destroying my own empire to save you, that's the only thing I've done in 32 years that actually felt like it mattered. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. You're not supposed to say things like that. You're supposed to be cold and calculating. I'm supposed to be honest. You taught me that. Calculation without genuine connection is just mathematics. Effective maybe, but ultimately empty. She crossed to where he sat and did something she'd never done before. Climbed into his lap like a child seeking comfort, pressing her face against his shoulder, letting herself be vulnerable in a way that would have been impossible weeks ago. Adrian wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, feeling her breathe against him. This was what he'd been missing his entire life without knowing it. Not power or control or reputation, but this. Simple human connection with someone who saw all his flaws and chose him anyway. I love you, Evelyn whispered against his shoulder. I didn't expect to. Didn't think I was capable of it after everything, but I do. Adrian felt his chest tighten with emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. He wanted to say it back. wanted to tell her that she'd become the center of his world, that her survival mattered more than anything he'd ever built or controlled. But the words stuck in his throat, decades of conditioning making it almost impossible to voice feelings that made him vulnerable. "I know," Evelyn said, sensing his struggle. "You don't have to say it. I can feel it in how you protect me, how you changed everything about your life to keep me safe, how you look at me when you think I'm not watching." "I want to say it," Adrian managed. "I just don't know how. The words feel inadequate." "Then show me instead. Actions have always been your language anyway." So Adrian kissed her, pouring into it everything he couldn't articulate. The terror he'd felt watching her testify in court, the rage at Edmund and Victor for hurting her, the desperate relief when the verdicts came through, the quiet joy of her presence in his home, transforming cold spaces into warmth. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn smiled. "That was a very eloquent statement, Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected, "just Adrian. I think the grace died somewhere between breaking into government buildings and getting arrested." "Then just Adrian," she said. "Adrian who destroyed an empire for me. Adrian who learned to be human instead of untouchable. Adrian who's going to spend the rest of his life proving that power without compassion is just tyranny in expensive clothes. That's a long rehabilitation project. Good thing we have time." They stayed like that for hours, Evelyn in Adrian's lap, both of them slowly accepting that the crisis was actually over. Edmund and Victor were imprisoned. The legal proceedings were concluded. The immediate danger had passed. Now came the harder work. Learning to live without constant threat, building something sustainable from the wreckage of everything they'd destroyed to survive. Around midnight, Evelyn finally stood, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. "I should sleep. Tomorrow I'm meeting with architects about the first shelter location." "I'll come with you," Adrian said. "If you want company." "I want company." Evelyn held out her hand. "But tonight will you just hold me? No expectations, no performance. Just two people who survived something terrible and need to remember they're safe now." Adrian took her hand and led her to his chambers. They lay together on top of the covers, fully clothed, Evelyn's head on Adrian's chest, and his arms wrapped around her. It was intimate without being sexual, vulnerable without being overwhelming. "Tell me something," Evelyn said quietly. "What would you say to your father if you could? About everything that happened?" Adrian thought about the portrait in his study, the stern, disapproving face that had governed his entire life. "I'd tell him that he was wrong. That building empires on fear and calculation just creates fragile structures that collapse the moment genuine humanity enters the equation. That I spent 32 years being what he wanted and achieved nothing that actually mattered until I stopped. Do you think he'd understand? No. But I don't need him to anymore. That's the difference. I spent my whole life seeking approval from a dead man who valued power over people. Now I value people over power, and if his ghost disapproves, that's his problem." Evelyn laughed softly. "The Iron Duke became a revolutionary. Who would have predicted that? Anyone who paid attention to what happened when someone finally cracked my armor. Turns out, I'm not cold underneath, just scared of what being warm might cost me. And now? Now I know the cost and I'll pay it anyway, because warm and damaged is better than cold and intact." They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd survived conspiracies and trials and the complete dissolution of everything they'd thought defined them. When Adrian woke in the morning, Evelyn was still in his arms, sleeping peacefully for perhaps the first time since childhood. He lay there watching her breathe, thinking about the strange path that had led them here. A political marriage that should have been cold and transactional. A conspiracy that should have destroyed them both. A desperate gamble that had cost Adrian everything he'd built and given him everything that actually mattered. The morning light filtering through the curtains looked different than it had weeks ago. Less harsh, more forgiving. Like the city itself had softened along with Adrian's defenses. Evelyn stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Morning. Morning," Adrian replied. "How do you feel?" "Safe. For the first time in longer than I can remember. And it's terrifying because I keep waiting for it to be taken away. It won't be." Adrian brushed hair from her face. "Edmund and Victor are gone. Your inheritance is restored. You control your own life now. The only person who can take your safety away is you. Then I better make sure I protect it." Evelyn sat up, her expression shifting from vulnerable to determined. starting with making sure no other woman ends up where I was. The shelter project isn't just charity, it's making sure Edmund's legacy is erased by something better. Adrian sat up beside her. I'll help. Money, connections, legal support, whatever you need. Just your presence, actually. Having the Duke of Blackthorn publicly supporting abuse survivors sends a message that power can be used for protection instead of exploitation. Former Ice Duke, Adrian corrected. Current work in progress. I like the work in progress better. Yes. They spent the morning reviewing shelter plans, discussing locations and security measures, and the 100 practical details required to transform good intentions into functional reality. Evelyn had a gift for organization that surprised Adrian until he remembered she'd spent 5 years surviving through careful planning and resource management. She'd just been applying those skills to escape instead of creation. Around noon, Marcus appeared with a visitor. Harrison Webb stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure whether he'd be welcome after everything. "Mr. Webb," Adrian said. "Come in." "Your Grace." Lady Eveline. Webb entered and accepted the chair Adrian offered. "I wanted to speak with you both personally, away from courtrooms and official proceedings." "About what?" Evelyn asked. Webb pulled out a folder. "About the fact that you both committed multiple crimes during your investigation of the Ashford conspiracy. Breaking and entering, theft of evidence, obstruction of Crown investigations, several other charges I could pursue if I wanted to be difficult." Adrian's jaw tightened. "We discussed this. You said the emergency necessity provision covered it. It does. Legally. But that doesn't mean there aren't people in government who think you should face consequences anyway. People who believe aristocrats shouldn't be allowed to break laws even for good reasons. So you're here to arrest us after all," Evelyn said flatly. "No." Webb opened the folder and pulled out documents. "I'm here to officially close the investigation with no charges filed. But I wanted you to understand something first. The legal system is designed with rules and procedures for good reasons. When people bypass those rules, even with noble intentions, it creates precedent. Next time someone decides the rules don't apply to them, they'll point to what you did as justification." "I understand," Adrian said. "And if I had it to do over, I'd make the same choice. Because the rules were being used against us by someone who understood the system better than we did. Waiting for official processes would have meant Victor destroyed evidence and escaped justice." "I know. That's why I'm not pressing charges. But, Your Grace, Lady Eveline, you both need to understand that what you did changed you. You're not innocent anymore. You broke laws, deceived officials, committed crimes. You did it for the right reasons, but you still crossed lines that can't be uncrossed." Eveline spoke quietly. "We cross those lines to survive. If that makes us criminals, then we're criminals. But we're free criminals instead of dead innocents. I'll take that trade." Webb nodded slowly. "I thought you'd say that. And honestly, I respect it. Sometimes the law fails people, and they have to save themselves. Just remember that the next time you're tempted to take matters into your own hands. The emergency excuse only works once." He stood, leaving the folder on Adrian's desk. "Those documents officially close your case. As far as the Crown is concerned, you cooperated with the investigation and helped bring dangerous criminals to justice. Your methods were unorthodox, but ultimately beneficial to public interest." "Thank you," Adrian said, "for believing the photographs and for giving us the chance to prove Victor's guilt." "Don't thank me, Your Grace. You did the hard part. I just made sure it counted." Webb left, and Adrian opened the folder to find official declarations of innocence, restoration of assets, formal apologies for the investigation, everything documented and legally binding. It was truly over now. No more legal threats hanging over them. No more waiting for the next disaster. Just the slow work of rebuilding lives from honest foundations. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Evelyn secured a location for the first shelter and began renovations. Adrian restructured his business operations, cutting ties with partners who'd proven exploitative and investing in enterprises that actually benefited workers instead of just extracting profit. They worked together in ways that felt natural, complementary. Eveline's passion for justice tempered by Adrian's strategic thinking. Adrian's tendency toward cold calculation warmed by Evelyn's genuine compassion. The society gossip never completely died down. People would always talk about the scandalous marriage between the Iron Duke and the abused heiress, the conspiracy that nearly destroyed them both, the crimes they'd committed to survive. But the gossip mattered less with each passing week. What mattered was the shelter opening to its first residents. What mattered was Adrian discovering he actually enjoyed using wealth to solve problems instead of just accumulating more of it. What mattered was Evelyn laughing freely, without the shadow of Edmund's violence haunting every moment. 6 months after the trial, they held a formal dinner at Blackthorn Manor. Not a massive society event, just close friends and the staff who'd stood by them through everything. Marcus gave a toast praising their courage. Evelyn gave a speech about survival and the responsibility of those with power to protect the vulnerable. When it was Adrian's turn, he stood with his glass raised and looked at the faces gathered around the table. People who'd seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. "I spent 32 years building an empire on the principle that power meant being untouchable," he said. "That vulnerability was weakness, and emotion was liability. I was wrong about almost everything. Real power isn't domination. It's having the courage to be human, even when being human is terrifying. It's choosing to protect someone else, even when that choice costs you everything you've built." He looked at Evelyn, who smiled through tears. "I lost my reputation and gained a life worth living. That's a trade I'd make again without hesitation." The room erupted in applause. Adrian sat down, feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight of performance, of maintaining the Iron Duke facade, finally gone. Later that night, after the guests had left and the staff had cleaned up, Adrian and Evelyn stood in the garden looking up at stars barely visible through London's haze. "Do you ever regret it?" Evelyn asked. "How different your life would be if you'd just ignored me that first night? Pretended you didn't see the bruises?" "Every day," Adrian said. Then she looked shocked until he continued. "I regret that we met under those circumstances. I regret that you suffered for years before I could help. I regret that saving you required destroying everything I'd built, but ignoring you, leaving you to Edmund's mercy, building my empire on your suffering, that I could never regret avoiding. Even though it cost you everything? It didn't cost me everything. It cost me reputation and control and the illusion of invincibility. Those aren't everything. They're just what I thought was everything before I learned better." Evelyn took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want to marry you again." Adrian looked at her in confusion. "We're already married. That was a political arrangement signed under duress. I want to marry you because I choose you, because I love you, because what we've built together is worth celebrating instead of treating like a convenient accident." Adrian felt his throat tighten with emotion that would have horrified the man he'd been 6 months ago. The Iron Duke didn't cry, didn't acknowledge feelings, didn't allow vulnerability. But Adrian Blackthorn, work in progress, felt tears on his face and didn't care who saw. "Yes," he said, "let's marry again. Properly this time. With vows that mean something besides strategic alliance." They set the date for 3 months later, giving Evelyn time to plan the wedding she actually wanted instead of the performance Edmund had orchestrated. Small ceremony, just people they cared about. No political theater, no society gossip targets. Just 2 people choosing each other with full awareness and genuine consent. The night before the ceremony, Adrian couldn't sleep. He stood in his study looking at his father's portrait, thinking about legacy and the different ways power could be wielded. "You'd hate what I've become," Adrian said to the painted face. "No empire, no reputation for ruthlessness, just a man trying to use wealth for something besides accumulation. But I'm happier than you ever were, and I think that might be the real victory." He turned away from the portrait and found Evelyn standing in the doorway, unable to sleep either. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," Adrian admitted. "Not of marrying you, of being someone capable of the vulnerability that marriage requires. I spent so long being untouchable that being touchable feels like standing on a cliff edge. Then we'll stand on that edge together." Evelyn crossed to him and took both his hands. "Tomorrow we promise to be honest with each other even when honesty is hard. To protect each other even when protection costs us comfort. To build something sustainable instead of something impressive." That's a hell of a vow. It's the only vow that matters. Everything else is just performance. The ceremony the next day was exactly what they'd wanted. Simple, honest, witnessed by people who actually cared about them instead of their social standing. When Adrian spoke his vows, promising to love and protect and choose Evelyn every day for the rest of his life, he meant every word with an intensity that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. And when Evelyn promised the same, looking at him with eyes that held no fear anymore, just love and determination and the fierce joy of someone who'd survived hell and chosen to live fully anyway, Adrian understood what he'd been missing his entire life. Connection. Real connection, built on truth instead of strategy, vulnerability instead of armor, love instead of calculation. They left the ceremony and walked through Blackthorn Manor's gardens, now planted with flowers Evelyn had chosen. The fortress had transformed into a home, cold spaces filled with warmth and life, and the possibility of genuine happiness. Adrian looked at Evelyn, his wife by choice now instead of arrangement, and felt something he'd never experienced before. Peace. Not the cold peace of control and dominance, but the warm peace of knowing he was exactly where he belonged. "You know what the strange thing is?" Adrian said as they walked. "I spent 32 years building power so I'd never be vulnerable to anyone. And the moment I let myself be vulnerable to you, I became more powerful than I'd ever been." "How do you figure?" "Because now I have something worth protecting that's actually valuable. Not reputation or wealth or control. You, us, the life we're building. That's worth fighting for in ways an empire never was." Evelyn leaned against him. "The Iron Duke learned to be human." "I'd say that's character development." Adrian laughed. "The hardest kind, but worth it." They stood there as the sun set over London, two people who'd been broken by conspiracy and remade through honest partnership. Tomorrow they'd continue the work of building shelters and restructuring businesses and creating legacies that actually mattered. But tonight they just existed together, grateful for survival and curious about who they'd become next. Because that was the truth Adrian had finally learned. You didn't have to be finished becoming yourself. You could keep growing and changing and learning to be better than you were yesterday. The Iron Duke was dead, but Adrian Blackthorn was just beginning to discover who he might become when he stopped performing invincibility and started practicing humanity. It was terrifying and liberating and worth every empire he'd destroyed to achieve. Years later, when historians wrote about the Duke who'd brought down the Ashford conspiracy and transformed from ruthless businessman to philanthropic reformer, they'd debate what changed him. Some would say it was love. Others would say it was trauma. A few would suggest it was calculated rebranding. But Adrian would know the truth. It was choice. The choice to see suffering and respond instead of looking away. The choice to risk everything comfortable for something meaningful. The choice to become vulnerable enough to love someone and be loved in return. That choice had cost him an empire and given him a life. Best trade he'd ever made. And standing in the garden with Evelyn beside him, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, Adrian Blackthorn finally understood what his father never had. That being untouchable meant being alone, and being human meant being alive. He'd choose alive every time.